Imagine a wall so vast it stretches across deserts, mountains, and centuries. Yet most people don't know why it was truly built. Generations risked everything to raise this giant, but its secrets, they're hidden in crumbling stones and forgotten legends. Some say it was protection. Others whisper of power, fear, and ambition driving every brick. What really happened along the Great Wall's winding path? There's one part of its story few ever hear. And once you learn it, you'll never see this wonder the same way again. If you took every brick and stone from the Great Wall of China and built a 5-foot barrier, it would circle the earth twice. But that calculation only counts the fortifications you can see. Beneath the Ming Dynasty's serpentine monument lie the bones of 5 previous walls, each built on the corpses of the one before, each representing another desperate attempt to solve a geographical curse that has haunted this land for 4,000 years. Walk any section today, and you're walking on humanity's longest cemetery, where over 1 million dead lie entombed in rammed soil and stone, their bodies mixed into the mortar by overseers who needed every kind of material to build faster than death could claim their workers. Actually, what tourists photograph isn't the Great Wall. It's the 6th one, built on a foundation of bones that stretches back to 2000 BC. By the end of this story, you'll understand why the rampart's greatest victory happened after they failed completely, and how one traitor at one gate undid 2,000 years of labor in a single day. You'll meet the emperor who killed more people raising his defenses than died in World War I, and discover why ancient inhabitants called the north the direction of death, a name that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with the sound of bone trumpets echoing across grasslands where winter kills everything that can't run fast enough. The curse begins with the land itself. Stand where the Yellow River makes its great bend near the Ordo's Loop, and you witness the knife edge where 2 worlds collide with volcanic force. To your south stretches the Wei River Valley, where millet grows thick in summer humidity, and villages cluster along irrigation channels older than memory. To your north opens the steppe, an ocean of grass that runs unbroken to the Arctic, where the horizon tricks your eyes, and the wind carries sounds from places that have no names in any language. This is the fracture line, where farmers meet nomads, where the plow meets the horse, where stored grain meets endless hunger. But why did this particular line become humanity's deadliest project site? The answer lies in what geographers call the 400-millimeter rainfall line, the invisible boundary where enough rain falls to grow crops reliably. North of this line, only grass survives the brutal winters and scorching summers. South of it, agriculture flourishes. And right along this line, for 4,000 years, 2 incompatible ways of life have ground against each other like tectonic plates. Liu Wei smells them coming before dawn breaks over the Yan Mountains in 1500 BC. The acrid stench of fermented mare's milk and the smoke from burning dung that clings to the northern raiders like a death shroud. From his watchtower, 1,500 years before Christ's birth, he tastes the copper fear that floods his mouth as shapes emerge from the morning mist. The sound reaches him next, war cries that freeze his blood, and the hollow boom of bone trumpets made from the skulls of horses and men, their music designed to panic both livestock and the people who depend on them. These are the peoples his Shang overlords call barbarians. Nomads who know no borders, acknowledge no kings, and take what they need from anyone too weak to stop them. But calling them barbarians misses the terrifying truth. They're perfectly adapted to their environment, while the inhabitants of this realm are desperately vulnerable outside theirs. The raiders' horses can gallop 50 miles without rest, Their warriors can shoot arrows backwards at full gallop while steering with their knees. They carry everything they need on their backs and can disappear into grassland that offers no landmarks, no roads, no places to hide for pursuing infantry who need supply trains and fixed camps to survive. What made the Ordo's loop so important that every dynasty died trying to control it? Look at a map and you'll see why strategists obsessed over this bend in the Yellow River. Control the Ordos, and you control the only reliable water source for hundreds of miles of steppe. Lose it, and nomadic armies can gather there by the tens of thousands, watering their horses while planning raids into the realm's heartland. The Ordos becomes a loaded gun pointed at civilization's throat, which explains why more barriers were built around this single geographical feature than anywhere else on the planet. The technique that creates these early fortifications sounds simple, but consumes lives with mechanical precision. They call it hangtu, rammed soil fabrication, and it transforms labor into something harder than bronze. Workers fill wooden forms with layers of moist dirt mixed with gravel, lime, and whatever organic matter they can find, including remains of the dead. Master Chen oversees 300 conscripts in 1400 BC as they create a section of barrier that will outlast the dynasty that ordered its fabrication. His workers swing wooden mallets in synchronized rhythm, each blow compacting ground until it becomes solid as stone. The sound echoes across the valley like a vast heartbeat. Thump, 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 10,000 hammers striking soil until the rhythm becomes hypnotic, deadly, inescapable. Actually, the Shang weren't the first to raise fortifications in this territory. Evidence reveals rammed dirt barriers dating to 2600 BC, built by cultures whose names we don't even know. What we do know is that they failed. Their defenses breached and their bones mixed into the foundations of the ramparts that replaced them. This pattern, build, die, rebuild, becomes the defining rhythm of this civilization's history. The men work from dawn until darkness makes precision impossible, their hands bleeding from handles worn smooth by countless others who held these same tools before dying or walking away broken. The winter mud they pound contains more than dirt. Fragments of broken pottery for strength, animal hair for binding, lime from burned shells, and increasingly, as the project demands speed, the bones of workers who died the day before. Why did ancient inhabitants believe that barriers could trap spirits? Because they literally could. When workers died during fabrication, from exhaustion, accidents, or disease, their bodies were often built directly into the next layer of rampart, rather than removed for burial. This wasn't cruelty, but necessity. Winter froze the ground too hard to dig graves, while removing corpses slowed work when spring thaws made continued assembly possible. The dead became part of the fortification they died creating. Zhang Lung discovers this truth in 775 BC, during the Zhou dynasty's frantic barrier raising as northern pressure intensifies. The 20-year-old conscript from Henan province carries stones for a rampart designed to protect his village, unaware that this same obstacle will trap him when armies turn on each other and retreat becomes impossible. The irony would be perfect if it weren't so common. Fortifications built to keep enemies out prove equally effective at keeping defenders in. But the real horror emerges during winter assembly, when temperatures drop so far that exhaled breath freezes instantly and the ground becomes harder than metal. Workers who collapse from exhaustion freeze in place. Their bodies discovered only when spring melts reveal hammer-wielding statues that must be chipped free from the soil they died compacting. The winter of 775 BC breaks records for both achievement and mortality. 300 li of new fortification, completed while losing over 6,000 workers, to cold, disease, and the kind of accidents that happen when desperate men move massive stones with bronze tools and failing strength. In fact, the Zhou dynasty's defenses failed in the most ironic way possible. The Quanrong Confederation that destroyed Zhou power in 771 BC didn't breach the barriers through superior siegecraft or military genius. They walked through gates opened by rebels who preferred barbarian rule to Zhou authority. King Ping watches from the ramparts of Haojing as enemy horsemen water their mounts in the Wei River. Their presence within the Zhou heartland, proof that the strongest fortifications mean nothing when the people they protect lose faith in the government they serve. How did a barrier built to keep people out become a prison keeping them in? The answer lies in the psychology of fortification. Ramparts don't just keep enemies out. They define who belongs inside and who doesn't, who deserves protection and who can be sacrificed. When Zhang Lung dies with a spear in his back, killed by soldiers from a neighboring state while defending defenses meant to stop foreign invaders, his death illustrates the fundamental paradox. The more barriers this realm builds against external enemies, the more it fragments internally. The massacre that eliminates the Western Zhou dynasty sends shockwaves through every court from the Yellow Sea to the Tibetan Plateau. The refugees who flee eastward carry more than personal possessions. They transport the psychological knowledge that fortifications can be overcome by enemies who understand that political unity matters more than architectural sophistication. Every prince who hears these reports draws the same conclusion. His defenses need to be higher, thicker, longer than anything built before. Why do the bones of laborers never decay? Experts excavating ancient sites consistently find remains preserved in lime-rich mortar that prevents decomposition while binding the assembly materials together. The calcium from crushed shells and burned limestone creates an alkaline environment where organic material, including tissue, mineralizes rather than rots. The workers didn't just die creating the barriers, they became part of the barriers, their preserved remains still holding stones in place after 3,000 years. By 600 BNE, when Confucius walks through the ruins of Zhou power, the landscape bears scars from 2 centuries of fortification that consumed over 300,000 lives while failing to prevent the political fragmentation it was designed to stop. The aging philosopher examines a stretch of abandoned defenses near Khufu, its rammed dirt foundations solid after decades of neglect, its upper works crumbling where wooden reinforcements have rotted away without maintenance. The sight inspires an observation that haunts strategic thinking for millennia. When barriers multiply, virtue diminishes, but understanding never stops the work. As Confucius speaks, 7 major states are preparing conflicts that will make previous assemblies seem modest in scale. The Warring States period approaches like a storm on the northern horizon, its promise of unprecedented violence driving military innovations that will consume lives with industrial efficiency. What made the Ordo's loop worth dying for? Control of this bend in the Yellow River meant controlling the steppes' only reliable water source, but it also meant something more terrifying: control of the gathering point where nomadic tribes could unite into armies large enough to threaten civilization itself. Every dynasty understood that losing the Ordos meant facing not scattered raids, but coordinated invasions that could end independence permanently. The death toll from pre-imperial fortification reaches staggering proportions: 50,000 dead in Shang foundations, 100,000 buried in Zhou defenses. 150,000 more in countless smaller barriers that individual nobles erected to protect territories that no longer exist. Added together, over 300,000 men died raising fortifications before unification. Their bones mixed into mortar that held stones protecting governments history has forgotten. And these numbers are actually conservative. Radar surveys of ancient sites show human remains packed in densities far beyond what records admit, hinting at either miscounting or suppression. The famous Shang oracle bones, turtle shells used for divination, contain queries about whether fortification should continue despite excessive losses among workers. The answers, inscribed in characters that predate modern writing, consistently urged continued assembly regardless of cost in lives. But why did rulers keep raising barriers when previous defenses had failed so catastrophically? The answer reveals something disturbing about the human mind. Each new leader believed his fortifications would be different, his defenses would be stronger, his ramparts would finally solve the ancient problem of defending agricultural civilization against nomadic pressure. Each failure taught the same lesson. Barriers are only as strong as the societies that build them. But each new ruler ignored this lesson while pursuing his own version of an impossible dream. What endures in the soil is more honest than any record. Ancient barriers rose at reckless speed. Their builders pushed to finish before cold. Enemies or politics brought everything to a halt. In the foundations, bones bear the marks of tools, proof that fallen workers were broken down and packed into the walls they could not finish. How did bone become a standard material? Calcium phosphate from decomposed remains actually strengthens rammed dirt fabrication by creating chemical bonds that pure soil cannot achieve. Ancient engineers discovered this property accidentally when defenses containing remains proved more durable than barriers built with dirt alone. This discovery led to the deliberate inclusion of bone meal and other organic matter in projects, a practice that continued for centuries. As the Warring States period dawns across this realm like blood-red sunrise, 7 kingdoms prepare to test their faith in stone and soil, with undertakings that dwarf anything seen before. The stage is set for an arms race that will reshape the landscape, while validating Confucius's darkest predictions about barriers and virtue. In the southern state of Chu, engineers survey routes for fortifications that will stretch 600 li through mountain passes that have never seen development on this scale. In the northern state of Yan, military architects design defenses, incorporating rivers and cliffs in continuous obstacles designed to channel barbarian attacks into killing zones. And in the western state of Qin, a young prince named Zheng studies maps showing enemy fortifications surrounding his territory like prison bars, their presence inspiring dreams of conquest that will eventually unify this land under a single emperor whose projects will make all previous assemblies seem modest. We're about to witness something unprecedented. 7 independent kingdoms, raising 7 separate fortifications simultaneously, each trying to block out the others while preparing for the ultimate conflict that will determine whether this civilization survives as a unified entity or fragments into perpetual warfare. The bloodiest chapter in the Great Barrier's history approaches with the inevitability of winter following harvest. The ghosts are gathering, 10,000 dead in the Yan Mountains, 50,000 buried in Shang foundations, 100,000 corpses in Zhou defenses, 300,000 total before unification even begins. But this is merely the prologue. The warring states are about to unleash undertakings that will make previous centuries look like childhood games played with toy blocks. By the time this story ends, you'll understand why the ancient saying, "one man dies for every meter of barrier," wasn't metaphor. It was accurate accounting. The Great Barrier isn't just the world's longest structure. It's the world's longest graveyard, built on bones that still hold its stones together after 4,000 years of wind, rain, and the endless passage of armies marching toward conflicts that fortifications never prevented. The nightmare frontier is about to become an industrial killing ground, where 7 kingdoms will raise 7 barriers while destroying themselves in the process. In 453 BC, China began building walls against itself. The Jin dynasty fractures that year into 3 competing states, Han, Wei, and Zhao. And within months, crews are raising fortifications where none existed before. Not against northern nomads, but against other Han people. Brother against brother, farmer against farmer, with ramparts marking boundaries where yesterday's allies become tomorrow's enemies. What started as protection against foreign raiders transforms into an arms race that will consume more lives than any tribal invasion ever could. This is when the Great Wall story gets truly insane. You think one fortification was expensive in human lives? Try 7 barriers built simultaneously by 7 different realms, each trying to block out the others while preparing for the ultimate war that will leave 6 of them dead and one ruling all the land. By the time this arms race ends, over 400,000 men will lie buried in foundations that stretch across territories larger than modern France. But why did these states suddenly start blocking each other out? The answer lies in what happens when a unified empire collapses and leaves a power vacuum that ambitious princes rush to fill. The Zhou dynasty's authority evaporates like morning mist, leaving behind a patchwork of independent territories whose borders shift with every military campaign. In this chaos, fortifications become weapons, obstacles that channel enemy armies into killing zones while protecting supply lines that feed increasingly professional forces. King Wuling of Zhao understands this new reality better than anyone. Standing on the ramparts of his capital at Hundan in 307 BC, the 40-year-old monarch watches Xiongnu horsemen demonstrate cavalry tactics that his infantry cannot counter using traditional methods. These steppe warriors ride with stirrups, a revolutionary technology that turns every fighter into a mobile archery platform capable of shooting accurately at full gallop. Their horses, bred for endurance rather than size, can cover ground that exhausts Han mounts, while carrying riders who learn to shoot before they could walk properly. The sight makes Wuling sick with recognition. His realm faces extinction unless it adapts to new realities that traditional warfare cannot address. The solution he chooses scandalizes his court and nearly costs him his life. Wuling orders his soldiers to adopt tribal dress, leather trousers instead of silk robes, felt caps instead of bronze helmets, and most shocking of all, training to fight from horseback, using tactics that Han tradition considers beneath civilized men. Wuling's going native represents one of military history's greatest strategic innovations, though it almost gets him killed by his own family. His uncle leads a palace revolt against what conservatives consider cultural treason, arguing that civilization will die if its defenders become indistinguishable from raiders. The assassination attempt fails, but barely. Wuling survives only because loyal guards discover the plot hours before the conspirators plan to strike during a state banquet. The military revolution that follows transforms Zhao's army into the most formidable force in northern territories. Wuling's cavalry learns to coordinate mounted archery with infantry support in ways that devastate traditional formations while matching nomadic mobility. More importantly, his soldiers begin work on a 600 Li barrier that incorporates these tactical innovations. Not a passive obstacle, but an active weapons system designed to channel enemy movements while providing platforms for crossbow towers that give defenders mechanical advantage over horse archers. But Zhao's fortification represents only one strand in a web of defenses that spreads across the former Zhou territories, like frost covering a window. Each state faces unique threats that demand specialized defensive solutions, creating projects whose diversity reflects the ingenuity that desperation inspires. The state of Qi builds its barrier using natural obstacles that reduce assembly costs while maximizing defensive effectiveness. Master builder Li Bing surveys terrain along Qi's western border, identifying mountain ridges and river valleys that need minimal human modification to become impassable barriers. Where nature provides cliff faces, his crews erect watchtowers and beacon stations. Where rivers create natural moats, they construct fortified bridges that can be destroyed during emergencies. The result is 400 Li of fortification that uses geography as material while requiring only 30,000 workers, a third of what pure fabrication would demand. Wei faces a more complex challenge: enemies on two fronts. The territory's eastern border confronts other Han states whose armies use familiar tactics and conventional siege equipment. Its northern frontier faces tribal raiders, whose mobility makes fixed defenses problematic. Wei's solution is unprecedented: a double barrier system that creates concentric defensive zones tailored to different threats. The inner rampart, facing east toward Han enemies, employs massive stonework designed to resist siege engines and prolonged assault. Towers every 200 paces house crossbow artillery that can penetrate any armor, while killing zones between sections trap attacking infantry in fields of interlocking fire. The outer defenses, facing north towards steppe territory, use lighter fabrication but incorporate mobile defensive elements: gates that can be repositioned quickly, towers that collapse into the barrier when abandoned, and supply caches that enable rapid response to raids that might strike anywhere along 300 Li of frontier. Wei's double barrier system becomes the template for military architecture that influences fortress design for centuries. The principle of layered defense, multiple obstacles that force enemies to fight through successive killing zones, proves so effective that every subsequent dynasty incorporates similar concepts into their fortifications. But this innovation comes at a staggering cost. 80,000 workers die building Wei's defenses, their bodies incorporated into foundations that grow stronger with each addition. The human cost escalates as competition intensifies, and states begin poaching each other's engineering expertise through methods that range from bribery to kidnapping. Chu's rampart, stretching across southern mountains that have never seen work on this scale, consumes 50,000 lives while pioneering techniques for assembly in terrain so vertical that workers must be lowered from cliff tops on ropes. Zhao's northern barrier, designed to stop both raiders and rival armies, kills 100,000 men while creating the first long fortification that attempts continuous defense across territories larger than most European realms. Why did the Yan state build the longest barrier of all? Geography and politics combine to create a perfect storm of strategic necessity. Yan occupies the northeastern corner of the Han world, surrounded by tribal peoples on two sides and ambitious neighbors on the third. King Zhao of Yan recognizes that his territory's survival depends on creating obstacles that can channel all potential enemies into areas where his limited military resources can be concentrated effectively. The Yan fortification becomes a 600 LE monument to strategic desperation, stretching from the coast near modern-day Beijing westward into mountains where winter temperatures drop so far that workers' tools shatter like glass. Assembly begins in multiple locations simultaneously, work crews racing against seasonal weather patterns that limit building to 6 months per year. The engineering challenges are unprecedented. Sections crossing river valleys require bridge fabrication that incorporates defensive elements, while mountain segments demand quarrying operations that strip entire hillsides of usable stone. General Qin Kai leads the northern sections, his experience fighting steppe peoples enabling him to design fortifications that anticipate enemy tactics rather than simply reacting to them. His barriers incorporate firing positions calculated for crossbow ranges, sally ports positioned to enable surprise attacks on besieging forces, and supply routes that remain functional even when main gates fall to enemy assault. The attention to detail reflects hard-won knowledge that mistakes in defensive work means death for everyone the fortifications fail to protect. But the most revolutionary innovation emerges from the communication systems that coordinate defensive efforts across distances that previously made unified response impossible. The beacon fire networks that link watchtowers enable messages to travel 1,000 LI in a single night, faster than any horse can gallop, more reliable than any messenger system. Coded smoke signals during daylight and fire patterns after dark create a communication grid that transforms isolated fortresses into elements of coordinated defensive systems. These beacon systems represent humanity's first long-distance telecommunication networks, with protocols so sophisticated that emergency messages can distinguish between different types of threats while indicating the size of attacking forces. A single fire means raiders numbering fewer than 500. 2 fires indicate armies between 500 and 5,000. 3 fires warn of invasions exceeding 10,000 warriors. Additional codes specify whether enemies are mounted or on foot, whether they carry siege equipment, and whether they appear to be probing defenses or mounting serious assault. The garrison agriculture that sustains these defensive networks creates self-sufficient communities that blur the line between military installation and civilian settlement. Soldiers assigned to barrier sections spend growing seasons cultivating crops while maintaining weapons training that enables rapid response to threats. Their families live in fortified villages that can support siege conditions while providing manufacturing capabilities that produce arrows, repair equipment, and the endless stream of replacement materials that fortification maintenance requires. Commander Zhang Yi oversees a garrison of 500 families along Yan's western defenses, his authority extending over agricultural operations that must feed his command, while producing surplus crops for civilian populations that depend on military protection. The soldiers who patrol his section during spring planting carry hoes as well as spears, their daily routine switching between combat training and farm labor according to seasonal demands. Children born in these garrison communities learn archery alongside reading, metalworking beside mathematics, creating a warrior-farmer culture that can sustain defensive operations indefinitely. The military marketplace that develops around barrier assembly creates the first standardized weapons production in human history. Crossbow bolts manufactured in Qi workshops fit crossbows produced in Wei armories, while bronze arrowheads from Chu forges mount properly on shafts from Yan suppliers. This standardization reflects military necessity. Armies operating hundreds of miles from home bases cannot afford equipment that requires specialized maintenance or unique replacement parts. But standardization also enables technological advancement that accelerates as states compete to gain advantages that might prove decisive in final confrontations everyone knows are coming. The proto-crossbow towers that begin appearing along the most sophisticated fortification sections provide mechanical advantage that allows individual operators to match the firepower of multiple horse archers, while remaining protected behind stone obstacles. Master crossbow maker Dong Zhongshu perfects trigger mechanisms that enable rapid fire without sacrificing accuracy, his workshops producing weapons whose bronze components fit together with tolerances that rival modern manufacturing. The crossbows that emerge from his forges can penetrate any armor at ranges that exceed nomadic bow capabilities while requiring less training than traditional archery demands. A farmer's son can become proficient with a crossbow in weeks, while mastering the horse archery that raiders begin learning in childhood takes years of practice that sedentary agricultural populations cannot afford. The crossbow revolution changes everything about warfare between agricultural and nomadic peoples. For the first time in history, settled populations gain ranged weapons that match or exceed tribal capabilities, while remaining usable by farmers who cannot dedicate their entire lives to military training. The psychological impact proves as important as the tactical advantage. Han soldiers manning crossbow towers no longer fear steppe archery, while tribal warriors discover that traditional hit-and-run tactics become suicidal when practiced against positions that can kill at distances their own bows cannot reach. This technological arms race triggers responses from nomadic peoples who recognize that defensive innovations threaten their traditional advantages. North of the fortifications, beyond the reach of beacon fires and crossbow towers, a more dangerous development begins taking shape. The unification of tribal groups under leaders who understand that fragmented raids can no longer succeed against integrated Han defenses. Modern Chanyu emerges as the steppe leader who transforms scattered nomadic groups into the Xiongnu Confederation, his political genius creating unified command structures that enable coordinated campaigns against Han positions. The young warrior who begins his career raiding isolated farms develops into a strategist whose understanding of Han's strengths and weaknesses exceeds that of most civilized generals. His spies study barrier assembly techniques, his scouts map beacon network patterns, and his commanders interrogate deserters who provide intelligence about defensive weaknesses that theoretical planning cannot reveal. The rise of the Xiongnu represents more than tribal unification. It demonstrates adaptive capacity that matches Han innovation, while exploiting advantages that sedentary populations cannot counter through purely defensive measures. Modern's confederation controls territory larger than all 7 states combined, while his mobile headquarters can relocate faster than armies can march to intercept them. The fortifications that individual realms build to protect their territories serve Xiongnu interests by preventing Han states from supporting each other during coordinated campaigns. Why did deserters become the nomads' most valuable military assets? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about the human cost of barrier assembly that rulers prefer to ignore. Men pressed into work service often choose death in tribal raids over death from exhaustion and disease in labor camps. The deserters who survive their escape carry detailed knowledge of defensive systems, assembly techniques, and military capabilities that enable tribal commanders to identify vulnerabilities that could never be detected from external observation. These deserters teach Xiongnu engineers to build siege equipment using Han methods while adapting designs for mobile warfare that nomadic armies require. The catapults that Modern's forces eventually deploy against fortifications incorporate principles learned from deserters who helped build the barriers they now help destroy. This transfer of military technology creates feedback loops that accelerate innovation on both sides. while ensuring that advantages remain temporary, as each improvement generates countermeasures. The strategic situation becomes increasingly unstable as barrier fabrication consumes resources that states need for military modernization while creating commitments that prevent flexible response to changing threats. Each realm's fortification requires permanent garrison forces that cannot be deployed elsewhere, while maintenance costs drain treasuries that could otherwise finance mobile forces capable of offensive operations. King Zhao of Yan discovers this dilemma when Xiongnu forces bypass his expensive defenses by moving through territories belonging to neighboring states whose own barriers cannot stop coordinated assault. The 80,000 men who died building Yan's fortification created obstacles that protect against direct attack, while proving useless against enemies who simply avoid them entirely. The strategic inflexibility that defenses create becomes a vulnerability that mobile enemies exploit with increasing effectiveness. Meanwhile, in the western state of Qin, a young prince named Zheng studies reports from all 7 states while calculating possibilities that his competitors have not considered. The maps spread across his table show enemy fortifications surrounding Qin territory, like prison bars, their fabrication intended to contain his domain's expansion while protecting neighbors from Qin's increasingly professional military forces. But Zheng sees opportunity where others see obstacle. Every barrier his enemies build requires resources they cannot use for mobile forces, while every garrison they station creates military commitments that reduce their strategic flexibility. The prince, who will eventually become the first emperor, understands that fortifications represent defensive mindsets, and defensive mindsets belong to states that have already accepted limits on their ambitions. The death toll from warring states' barrier assembly reaches horrific proportions as projects compete for workers, while seasonal pressures force accelerated schedules that prioritize speed over safety. Chu's mountain fortification, 50,000 dead. Zhao's northern barrier, 100,000 dead. Yan's coastal defenses, 80,000 dead. Wei's double rampart system, 70,000 dead. Qi's integrated obstacles, 40,000 dead. Han's border fortifications, 30,000 dead. Combined casualties from all 7 realms, over 400,000 men dead before unification begins. These numbers represent only direct assembly casualties and exclude deaths from disease, malnutrition, and exposure in labor camps, where living conditions make frontline military service seem comfortable by comparison. The total human cost of warring states' fortification likely exceeds 500,000 lives, more than died in many medieval wars, all to build barriers that will prove useless when final confrontation determines the land's fate. 7 states, 7 barriers, 400,000 dead. And in the realm of Qin, a young prince named Zheng watches and calculates, his ambitions growing with each report of enemy defensive work that consumes their strength while revealing their limitations. The prince who dreams of universal empire recognizes that his competitors are building their own prisons, obstacles that will trap them when the time comes for final reckoning. The warring states' arms race in stone, and Earth approaches its climax as each territory completes fortifications that represent the best defensive thinking of their age, while demonstrating the ultimate futility of defensive strategies. The barriers that should have protected 7 states will instead witness their destruction, their stones becoming foundations for a unified empire whose own assembly projects will make everything built before seem modest by comparison. But first, the realms that built these defenses must die, their armies broken and their territories absorbed by the one state whose prince understood that fortifications represent the past while conquest represents the future. The bloodiest chapter in this civilization's history approaches as 7 barriers prepare to become monuments to the domains they failed to save. The ruler who unified China was terrified of mortality, and so he built the world's longest tomb. Qin Shi Huang stands on the ramparts of his newly conquered capital at Xianyang in 221 BC, gazing north towards steppes that have haunted his dreams since childhood. The first sovereign, for that is what he calls himself now, has achieved what no monarch before him managed. The 7 fractured realms lie crushed beneath his armies, their competing dynasties extinct, their separate currencies melted down for bronze weapons, their individual laws replaced by his universal code. Yet victory tastes bitter as winter wind when he contemplates the northern frontier, where nomadic tribes mass like storm clouds beyond the scattered fortifications his defeated enemies built. Those defenses, the fragmented ramparts of Yan, Zhao, and the northern states, represent both opportunity and nightmare to the sovereign's calculating mind. Each fortification required hundreds of thousands of people to build, yet each protected only a fragment of territory, while leaving gaps that raiders exploited with devastating efficiency. What if those separate obstacles could become one continuous rampart? What if the blood sacrifice that built 7 scattered defenses could be surpassed by an undertaking that dwarfs everything attempted before? All fortifications must become one fortification, the first sovereign declares to his assembled generals, his voice carrying the authority of a man who has never heard the word impossible applied to his ambitions. The courtiers who witnessed him bury 400 scholars alive for questioning his policies, understand that when their ruler speaks of unification, he means it with the same lethal precision he applied to unifying the realm through conquest. But this vision demands more than royal decree. It requires engineering genius capable of coordinating the largest labor project in human history. Shi Huang summons General Meng Tian to the throne room where maps cover tables like battle plans, their ink lines marking routes through terrain that has never seen organized effort on the scale the monarch contemplates. Meng Tian, whose family has served Qin for 3 generations, studies these charts with the practiced eye of a man who understands that sovereign commands become reality, regardless of their apparent impossibility. Build me a rampart that runs from the sea to the desert, the conqueror commands, his finger tracing a line across territories that span distances greater than most men can walk in a lifetime. Make it so tall that mounted archers cannot shoot over it, so thick that siege engines cannot breach it, so long that no army can march around it. Make it the spine of the realm, permanent as mountains, eternal as stars. Meng Tian accepts this commission, knowing it will either crown his career with immortal glory or destroy his family through association with spectacular failure. The general who commanded cavalry charges that shattered the last resistance of Chu and Qi now faces challenges that make armed conquest seem simple by comparison. Moving armies requires feeding thousands of men for months. Building the tyrant's envisioned bulwark will require feeding millions of laborers for years, while transporting materials across distances that defeat conventional logistics. The human resources that this undertaking demands exceed anything attempted in recorded history. Criminal populations from across the unified territories provide the first labor contingent. Murderers, thieves, political dissidents, and captured rebels whose crimes have forfeited their right to comfortable existence. These condemned men number in the hundreds of thousands, their sentences commuted from execution to lifetime service, creating monuments that will outlast their bones. But criminals alone cannot satisfy the sovereign's vision. Conscription sweeps across the domain like harvest, gathering peasants whose strong backs and expendable existence represent the foundation upon which Huang's immortality will rest. Village headmen receive quotas: 10 men from settlements under 50 families, 20 from larger communities, 50 from district capitals. Resistance means the destruction of entire communities. Compliance means watching sons and fathers march north toward project sites where return remains unlikely. The third population, feeding this monstrous appetite for labor, consists of corvée servants, free men, fulfilling their annual obligation to state service. Unlike criminals condemned to perish or conscripts pressed into permanent service, these peasants serve fixed terms that promise eventual return to their farms and families. Yet the nature of rampart work transforms temporary obligation into permanent separation as disease, accidents, and exhaustion claim people faster than completed service can release them. Master engineer Liu Qing oversees logistics for the central sections, where terrain proves most challenging. His administrative genius coordinating supply trains that stretch across provinces while managing crews whose numbers fluctuate between mortality and recruitment, like populations during plague years. Each section of planned fortification requires different materials: stone quarried from mountain faces, earth dug from riverbanks, timber harvested from forests that must first be cleared of wolves and bandits. Moving these materials to project sites demands roads where none exist, bridges across rivers that have never been spanned, camps capable of housing populations larger than most cities. The feeding of this vast workforce becomes its own logistical nightmare. Peasants pressed into service must be fed well enough to work, but not so well that feeding them bankrupts the royal treasury. The solution that emerges reflects brutal calculation. Laborers receive enough grain to prevent immediate starvation, but insufficient nutrition to maintain health during the grinding physical labor that assembly demands. Malnutrition weakens resistance to disease, while making accidents more likely, as exhausted men handle tools and materials whose misuse means fatality. Work begins simultaneously at dozens of locations as winter gives way to spring in 220 BC, the monarch's first year of unified rule becoming the opening chapter of the bloodiest building project in human history. The sites selected for initial effort represent the most strategic locations: mountain passes that control access to the heartland, river crossings that channel nomadic movements, plateaus that command extensive views of approaching enemies. Each location requires specialized techniques adapted to local conditions, while maintaining design standards that ensure the finished bulwark will function as a unified defensive system. The Ordos campaign represents the deadliest phase of early assembly, as crews battle both the harsh environment and active nomadic resistance to governmental expansion into traditional grazing territories. The loop of the Yellow River creates a natural fortress that controls access to the northern steppes, but building permanent fortifications within this strategic zone requires defeating Xiongnu forces that contest every stone laid and every foundation dug. Commander Zhao Gao leads 300,000 peasants into the Ordos region during the summer of 219 BC. His mixed force of criminals, conscripts, and corvée labor, accompanied by 50,000 soldiers, whose mission involves protecting assembly as much as fighting enemies. The expedition that follows becomes a grinding conflict of attrition, where completion of each rampart section requires battles that claim thousands of people, while progress measured in lie costs tens of thousands more to disease and exhaustion. The men who survive their first winter in the Ordos discover horrors that previous building projects never encountered. Temperatures drop so far that human breath freezes instantly, while metal tools become brittle as glass, shattering when struck against frozen earth that refuses to yield to human effort. Laborers who collapse from exhaustion freeze solid before their bodies can be removed, creating grotesque sculptures that must be chipped from project sites when spring thaws make continued work possible. But the sovereign's vision demands acceleration, regardless of human cost, and acceleration requires innovations that transform assembly into industrial slaughter. The traditional method of hang tu, rammed earth compacted by hand tools, proves too slow for the scale of work the first sovereign envisions. New techniques emerge that prioritize speed over safety, massive wooden forms that collapse without warning, crushing men beneath tons of earth and stone. Mechanical hammers powered by teams whose exhaustion leads to accidents that kill dozens at once. Transportation systems that move materials at speeds that turn falling stones into deadly projectiles. The innovation that most horrifies crews involves the systematic processing of human remains as building material. Bodies of peasants who perish during assembly undergo deliberate treatment that incorporates their bones and flesh directly into rampart materials rather than removing them for burial. The lime used to stabilize rammed earth creates chemical reactions that preserve organic matter, while binding materials more effectively than earth alone can achieve. Men discover that sections built with human remains prove more durable than fortifications created with conventional supplies, creating incentives that transform mortality into building supplies. Lady Meng Jiangnu learns this truth when she journeys north from her village in Shandong to seek her husband Wan Shiliang, conscripted for rampart work 2 years earlier, without word of his fate reaching home. The young woman who travels hundreds of li through territories where bandits prey on solitary travelers finds project sites where overseers direct the grinding of bones into powder that crews mix with earth and water to create mortar stronger than anything achieved through traditional methods. Her desperate search through building sites reveals the systematic nature of human processing that governmental efficiency has perfected. Peasants who perish undergo categorization. Those dead from disease go into foundation layers where lime prevents decay. Those killed by accidents provide material for mortar production. Those executed for insubordination become examples whose public processing teaches lessons about the consequences of resistance to sovereign will. When Meng Jiangnu finally locates the section where her husband labored, she discovers only supervisors who remember his name in ledgers, recording fatalities from natural causes, a euphemism that covers everything from exhaustion to execution, while providing legal protection for officials whose administrative efficiency depends upon maintaining plausible documentation. The grief that overwhelms her becomes legend, her tears said to dissolve portions of the rampart, until her husband's bones emerge from foundations where they had been incorporated months earlier. Whether this legend reflects literal truth or symbolic recognition of assembly methods matters less than its persistence in oral tradition that preserves memory of human costs, that official records deliberately obscure. Songs that survive from this period describe bulwarks built with blood for mortar and bones for stones, their lyrics encoding testimonies that direct historical accounts cannot include, without implicating officials in practices that exceeded even royal tolerance for brutality. The administrative systems that coordinate this vast undertaking demonstrate governmental sophistication that enables sustained operations across continental distances. Meng Tian establishes headquarters at strategic locations along the planned rampart route, each command center controlling assembly across hundreds of li, while maintaining communication with the capital and neighboring administrative regions. Messenger services carry reports eastward, while supply trains move materials northward in logistical networks whose efficiency rivals anything achieved by modern governments. Record-keeping reaches obsessive detail as clerks document every aspect of building, from individual laborer assignments to daily consumption of materials. These archives, preserved in royal libraries, reveal the scope of human sacrifice that the tyrant's vision demanded. Mortality rates exceeding 60% among conscript crews, 90% among criminals sentenced to assembly service, 30% among corvée servants whose temporary obligations became permanent through fatalities that exceeded replacement rates. The numbers themselves become numbing in their magnitude. In 218 BC alone, project records document 127,000 casualties from various causes, while noting recruitment of 200,000 replacement hands needed to maintain workforce strength adequate for continued progress. By 215 BSC, cumulative losses exceed 300,000, while completed assembly spans less than half the planned distance, creating ratios that suggest total mortality might approach 1 million souls before the ruler's vision achieves completion. Yet the first sovereign drives building forward with increasing desperation as reports reach court describing portents that ancient texts interpret as warnings of royal mortality. Shooting stars, unusual cloud formations, and the birth of two-headed calves in the governmental stables feed the monarch's growing obsession with fate and the possibility that his reign might end before his monuments achieve completion. The man who conquered 7 realms discovers that time represents an enemy more formidable than any human opposition. Alchemists who promise immortality through mercury-based elixirs find sovereign favor, while engineers who warn about project delays face execution for defeatism. The conqueror who once based decisions on rational calculation increasingly relies on divination and magical thinking as mortality approaches, despite every effort to achieve permanence through monuments whose scale might impress gods into granting eternal existence. The fortification that rises across northern territories becomes both tomb and monument. As assembly continues through 211 BC, its growing height measured in the bones of peasants whose demise purchases each lie of completed bulwark. Stone watchtowers crown strategic peaks, while earth ramparts connect them in continuous obstacles, designed to channel nomadic raiders into killing zones where crossbow artillery can concentrate fire effectively. The engineering represents the culmination of centuries of defensive innovation, while the human cost exceeds everything attempted before. But the tyrant who demanded this monument never sees its completion. In 210 BC, while touring the eastern provinces to inspect project sites and seek immortality elixirs from Taoist sages, Huang dies suddenly during a summer storm that chroniclers interpret as divine judgment upon his excessive ambitions. The man who unified territories through conquest and sought to defeat fate through building becomes the first casualty of his own obsession with permanence. Meng receives word of royal demise while supervising assembly in the far northwest, where crews continue raising ramparts through territories so remote that news from the capital takes months to arrive. The general who commanded this vast undertaking recognizes that political changes following the sovereign's passing will likely end the project, while possibly costing him his existence for association with policies that bankrupted the realm and traumatized its population. The first sovereign's passing triggers succession struggles that consume the regime's remaining resources, while laborers desert their posts to return home or join rebel armies forming throughout the territories. The bulwark that cost over 400,000 people during its first decade stands incomplete, its unfinished sections testament to the gap between royal ambition and human capability. Yet even unfinished, the monument spans distances that dwarf previous fortifications, while establishing precedents that future dynasties will follow in their own attempts to solve the eternal problem of nomadic pressure. The irony would be perfect if it weren't so tragic. The ruler who sought immortality through assembly died before his monument was completed, while the rampart he built outlasted his dynasty by millennia. Peasants returning to villages they left years earlier carry memories of project sites where human bones provided building material, their testimonies preserved in folk songs that remember costs that official histories prefer to forget. The Great Fortification's first incarnation stands as monument to both royal vision and human tragedy, its stones held together by mortar, mixed with the ground bones of men who perished believing their sacrifice served purposes greater than their individual existence. Time will prove them right and wrong simultaneously. Right that their bulwark influenced history for centuries. Wrong that their demise prevented the nomadic invasions they died trying to stop. In the end, the first sovereign achieved the immortality he sought, though not through mercury elixirs or magic potions. The ruler exists forever in the rampart that bears his name, his bones joining those of his subjects in foundations that still hold stones against wind, weather, and the endless passage of armies marching toward conflicts that fortifications never prevented. They found the true burden wasn't in building walls, it was in maintaining them. Emperor Wu stands in his palace at Chang'an in 138 BC, studying reports that describe the crumbling remains of the first sovereign's great fortification. 50 years have passed since the Qin regime collapsed beneath the weight of its own ambitions, leaving behind thousands of ramparts that stretch across northern territories, like a stone serpent slowly returning to dust. Wooden watchtowers sag under decades of neglect, their timbers rotting in winds that carry sand into every crevice. Earth foundations that once stood firm as mountains now erode with each storm, while bones mixed into ancient mortar bleach white under relentless sun. Beyond the immediate borders, Xiongnu horsemen exploit gaps in the defensive line with devastating efficiency. These nomadic raiders penetrate hundreds of li into Chinese territory before retreating beyond the reach of pursuit, their attacks proving that abandoned fortifications offer no protection when left unmaintained. Yet rebuilding the deteriorated sections would require 300,000 men, laboring for 3 years at costs exceeding the royal treasury's current reserves. Wu possesses ambitions that dwarf mere reconstruction of previous rulers' monuments. The young sovereign who inherited a unified realm dreams of westward drive into territories that no Chinese army has ever seen, lands where silk and jade flow along trade routes connecting the Middle Kingdom to markets beyond the edge of the known world. These western regions, the strategic corridor, the Tarim Basin, the mysterious kingdoms beyond the Pamirs, represent opportunities for wealth and glory that defensive thinking cannot achieve. We shall not merely repair old ramparts, the ruler declares to his assembled court, his voice carrying confidence of a man whose armies have never known defeat. We shall extend them, from the Great Bend to the Western Sea, from the northern wastes to the Kunlun Mountains. Chinese defenses shall mark the boundaries of civilization itself. Through imperial decree, the sovereign launches the most ambitious territorial growth in Chinese history. General Huo Kubing leads the advance guard westward from traditional boundaries toward regions where Chinese maps show only blank spaces marked lands of the barbarians. Behind him march 150,000 soldiers, their ranks followed by engineers, administrators, and the inevitable multitude of peasant laborers whose muscles and blood will transform royal vision into physical reality. When armies reach the Hexi corridor, they encounter the first target of this westward drive. This narrow passage between mountains and wasteland controls access to Silk Road trade routes while providing the only practical pathway for forces moving between China proper and the western regions. Whoever controls the corridor controls the flow of goods, people, and armies across Central Asia, while its capture would drive a wedge between the Xiongnu Confederation and their Tibetan allies. Across the Gobi, terrain challenges emerge that make previous boundary warfare seem comfortable by comparison. The arid expanse stretches endlessly westward, its landscape so barren that a man can walk for days without finding water adequate for a single drink. Summer temperatures soar beyond human endurance, while winter cold freezes breath in men's nostrils, creating conditions where exposed skin dies within minutes. Among the nomadic peoples who inhabit these wastelands, survival skills surpass anything their eastern cousins possess. Intimate knowledge of water sources, weather patterns, and seasonal migrations determines existence in environments where cities cannot function. Master engineer Zhang Qian oversees the most challenging building project in dynastic history, as work crews begin extending defenses through terrain that defeats conventional techniques. Despite abundant experience with traditional methods, workers discover that shifting sands make rammed earth foundations impossible, while water scarcity prevents mixing of mortar that binds stone assembly. New approaches emerge through desperate innovation. Foundations dug down to bedrock even when bedrock lies 30 feet below surface. Stone transported hundreds of li from mountain quarries, and water carried in leather bags from oases so distant that supply trains require armed escorts. Within months of beginning work, casualties escalate beyond anything experienced during Qin projects, as laborers battle environments actively hostile to human survival. The harsh terrain consumes men through dehydration, exposure, and diseases that flourish in extreme conditions of outpost camps, where sanitation becomes impossible and medical supplies remain inadequate. Mortality rates exceed 70% among crews assigned to Western sections. Between physical hardship and psychological torment lies an even more devastating toll. Soldiers assigned to garrison duty in completed strongholds discover isolation that drives strong men to madness within months of assignment. The Western ramparts stand so far from Chinese civilization that messengers require weeks to carry news from the capital, while supply trains arrive so infrequently that garrisons must survive on stored provisions that often spoil before consumption. Throughout the extended periphery, desertion rates reach catastrophic levels as troops abandon posts rather than endure conditions that make death seem preferable to continued service. Morning inspections reveal empty watchtowers so commonly that officers cease recording individual cases, noting simply "position abandoned" in reports documenting systematic breakdown of morale. Some deserters attempt returning to home villages, their bodies later discovered along routes where thirst and exposure claim those lacking nomadic survival skills. During the darkest periods, suicide becomes so prevalent among garrison forces that commanders establish policies requiring multiple witnesses before weapons can be issued to individual soldiers. Official records describe these measures as administrative necessities, without acknowledging their true purpose. Yet the regulations themselves reveal conditions transforming service into systematic torture for men whose only crime involved answering their government's call. Against mounting evidence of human catastrophe, the sovereign's strategic vision demands continued westward drive regardless of consequences. The Tuntian system emerges as an attempted solution to logistical problems through colonization, combining necessity with agricultural production. Instead of supplying distant garrisons through transport trains, consuming enormous resources while remaining vulnerable to nomadic attack, the empire establishes agricultural colonies where soldier farmers grow their own food while maintaining defensive positions. Among the innovations attempted in Western territories, these settlements represent revolutionary changes in boundary warfare, creating sustainable defensive systems operating independently of external support. Yet the first colonies planted in the Western Passage reveal both potential and limitations of this approach. Soldiers spending growing seasons cultivating barely adequate crops in soil, barely suitable for agriculture, must simultaneously maintain combat readiness for attacks arriving without warning. At Dunhuang, the westernmost outpost of Chinese expansion, where the Silk Road begins its journey toward distant markets, Commander Li Guangli establishes a model colony. His garrison of 3,000 men must transform barren land into productive farmland, while creating strongholds capable of resisting siege by confederated nomadic armies, outnumbering his forces 10-1. Through seasons of grinding labor, the dual mission reveals contradictions that no administrative efficiency can resolve. Irrigation systems require constant maintenance by men whose duties frequently take them away from canal cleaning and dam repair determining crop survival. When steppe peoples destroy months of agricultural work in single nights of concentrated vandalism, psychological impact on soldier farmers often proves more devastating than direct combat casualties. Still, those settlements that endured their earliest years grew into communities thriving against all odds. Families joining soldier farmers in boundary regions bring skills and motivations that pure garrisons cannot provide. Women accompanying husbands westward prove essential for maintaining morale, while contributing labor enabling agricultural success, their presence transforming outposts into genuine communities where children play between defensive towers. Within successful colonies, psychological transformation reveals how humans adapt to environments initially seeming impossible to survive. Troops arriving expecting short-term service gradually accept permanent residence in territories, becoming home through familiarity and investment in community development. Their children, born in remote outposts, grow up regarding sand and stone as normal landscapes, while developing skills enabling survival in conditions that would kill their grandparents. Before long, second-generation colonists become invaluable assets, whose knowledge of local conditions exceeds anything newly arrived forces achieve through training. Young men learning to read weather patterns, locate water sources, and interpret subtle signs indicating nomadic movement in terrain, where tracks disappear within hours, possess advantages turning defensive positions into intelligence-gathering centers. Throughout the western regions, integration of natural barriers with constructed defenses represents another innovation emerging from challenging building conditions. Traditional rampart creation requires massive amounts of material and labor to create obstacles where none exist naturally. But Western territories offer geographical features incorporated into defensive systems with minimal human modification. Under careful survey, mountain passes channeling movement into narrow corridors need only watchtowers and gates to become effective barriers, while river valleys provide natural killing zones where crossbow artillery concentrates fire against enemies unable to avoid predetermined routes. The resulting systems resemble giant spiderwebs stretched across terrain features, their relatively short constructed sections connected by natural obstacles channeling enemy movements toward positions where human defenders possess maximum advantage. Even more sophisticated innovations involve diplomatic defenses, rampart sections built not to stop invasions, but to control and tax trade, generating revenue for continued operations. Barriers rising across traditional caravan routes force merchants through Chinese checkpoints, where officials collect tariffs while monitoring flows of goods, people, and information, connecting Eastern and Western markets. Upon establishment, customs stations at these checkpoints become economic engines, transforming expenses into revenue generators. Taxes on silk, jade, spices, and precious metals provide funds supporting garrison operations, while generating profits justifying continued westward advance. Merchants initially resenting Chinese interference in traditional trade routes gradually appreciate security that protection provides against bandits and raiders who previously extracted tribute through violence rather than legal taxation. Over time, transformation of the Silk Road from unregulated caravan routes into Chinese-controlled transportation system represents the most successful aspect of territorial growth. Economic foundations sustain operations while generating cultural exchanges, enriching Chinese civilization through contact with foreign ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions. Watchtowers beginning as positions evolve into commercial centers where Chinese traders meet foreign merchants. Nevertheless, effectiveness of extended defenses proves disappointing when tested by coordinated nomadic attacks exploiting the system's greatest weakness. Enormous length creates too many positions for available troops to defend adequately. The breakthrough occurring at the Jade Gate in 99 BC demonstrates how Xiongnu forces under Chanyu Jukudi penetrate Chinese defenses not through superior siege techniques, but through systematic intelligence gathering, identifying weakly held sections. Following this penetration, massacre eliminates an entire Tuntian colony, its soldier farmers and families becoming casualties, revealing limitations of defensive strategies in regions where enemies possess mobility, advantages that fixed strongholds cannot counter. Wells providing water for Chinese agriculture are poisoned with corpses, irrigation channels sustaining crops destroyed beyond repair, and buildings housing families burned to eliminate shelter, encouraging future colonization attempts. As news spreads along the entire periphery, garrison commanders recognize their positions remain vulnerable to similar attacks, regardless of fortification, strength, or troop quality. Isolation, previously seeming merely uncomfortable, now appears deadly, while supply lines connecting positions to Chinese civilization seem inadequate for providing assistance when emergencies develop faster than messages can travel. In response to these setbacks, the ruler's calculation reveals ruthless approach to boundary problems. Rather than reducing commitments to sustainable levels, he orders acceleration of building combined with population transfers, emptying entire regions of China proper to provide colonists for Western territories. Forced migrations traumatize millions of peasants whose families have lived in the same villages for centuries. By the end of Wu's reign, casualties from westward drive eventually exceed 200,000, including personnel, civilian colonists, and laborers whose bones join those of Qin predecessors, in foundations continuing to grow, despite mounting evidence that costs exceed benefits by margins threatening the dynasty's survival. Cumulative mortality from fortification projects now approaches 1.2 million lives, their sacrifice purchasing defensive systems failing repeatedly when tested by enemies refusing to respect Chinese assumptions about warfare. Still, ramparts continue rising across Western territories as imperial ambitions drive growth toward regions existing more in royal imagination than geographical reality. Logic justifying continued creation, despite repeated failures, reflects psychological traps ensnaring rulers who mistake map drawing for conquest, confusing boundary creation with control of territories boundaries supposedly contain. At Wu's death, the empire's western defenses stand as monuments to both human determination and strategic confusion, their stones held together by mortar mixed with bones of people who died believing barriers could solve problems requiring wisdom rather than assembly. Winds sweeping across these strongholds carry sand, slowly burying defensive positions, while the steppe peoples they were built to contain continue their migrations as if Chinese ramparts were merely temporary inconveniences rather than permanent solutions to ancient conflicts. In the monastery courtyard at Huang, Brother Dharmaraksha kneels before wooden tablets covered in Sanskrit verses, translating the Lotus Sutra by lamplight, while camels bellow outside the gates. The year is 286 AD, and Buddhism flows eastward through the same stone passages that once channeled only Chinese troops westward. What began as military checkpoints designed to stop foreign influence have become the very gateways through which foreign wisdom enters the empire. The greatest irony of the Han expansion into the desert wastes is not that it failed to stop nomadic raiders. It succeeded brilliantly at that, but that it created a commercial empire that made the nomads wealthy beyond the dreams of any tribal confederation. Through the Jade Gate at Yumen Pass, Persian merchants in silk robes argue prices with Han bureaucrats over sacks of cinnamon bark worth more than a farmer's lifetime earnings. The customs house echoes with languages that have no Chinese characters: Sogdian trade argot, Kushan diplomatic phrases, Parthian curse words when scales tip unfavorably. Gold dinars from distant Rome clink against Han copper coins in leather pouches that smell of frankincense and horse sweat. Every transaction here proves that barriers built to exclude the world have instead learned to tax it. The bureaucrat Wei Qing, not the famous general, but his distant nephew, dips his brush in red ink to mark the passage of 200 bolts of purple silk destined for Antioch. His ledger records the transformation that no strategist anticipated. Military installations consuming 40% of imperial revenue have become commercial centers generating 60% of frontier taxes. The mathematics are simple enough that even a Confucian scholar can understand them. War costs money. Commerce makes money. Yet the empire continues building both. Below ground level, in the storage chambers carved from desert sandstone, Buddhist monks have established libraries where none were planned. Manuscripts wrapped in oiled silk contain sutras translated from Sanskrit into Chinese characters that bend under the weight of foreign concepts. Dharmaraksha works by feel in the darkness, his fingers tracing wooden printing blocks while his mind puzzles over how to render emptiness into ideograms that express fullness of meaning. Above him, soldiers patrol ramparts designed to keep ideas like his from entering the realm. The system works perfectly, except in reverse. Winter brings revelations that summer commerce obscures. When caravan traffic stops and snow blocks the mountain passes, the garrison towns reveal their true nature as hybrid communities, where Chinese farmers tend Buddhist shrines, while Sogdian traders wear Han court robes to local festivals. In the marketplace at Huang, vendors sell fermented mare's milk alongside millet wine, creating customers who understand both nomadic and agricultural tastes. Children born here speak 3 languages, before they learn that the empire considers 2 of them barbaric. The signal fire network that connects these scattered communities operates with mechanical precision and human unreliability. Beacon operators on Red Mountain Pass light fires that race messages across 200 miles in a single afternoon. But the messages themselves often arrive garbled by operators who speak different dialects, worship different gods, or simply prefer to sleep rather than maintain vigilance through desert nights that drop below freezing. During the Third Xiongnu War, a signal meaning 50 raiders are approaching from the north became 500 reinforcements needed immediately by the time it reached Luoyang, triggering a mobilization that bankrupted 3 provinces for an invasion that never occurred. Yet the network's failures create their own commercial opportunities. Merchants who understand signal protocols can profit from false alarms by buying grain futures when military buyers panic, then selling at premium prices when the danger passes. Persian traders have learned to read beacon patterns better than some Chinese commanders, using military intelligence for commercial advantage in ways that would horrify Confucian bureaucrats if they understood how thoroughly they have been outmaneuvered by foreign business practices. In the garrison mess halls that double as trading posts, cultural exchange happens at the level of the stomach. Chinese cooks learn to prepare mutton with Central Asian spices, while nomadic herdsmen develop tastes for fermented bean paste and pickled vegetables. Recipes cross linguistic boundaries more easily than diplomatic treaties, creating fusion cuisines that scandalize purists, but feed everyone more interestingly than strict cultural separation would allow. A Syrian Christian merchant named Marcus teaches Chinese soldiers to bake leavened bread, while learning from them the fermentation techniques that turn soybeans into protein-rich paste. The transformation reveals itself most clearly in the evolved architecture. Military barracks designed for 50 soldiers now accommodate 20 soldiers, 15 merchants, 10 translators, and 5 monks, with commercial stalls built into ground floors and religious shrines occupying corner rooms. Desert posts that once stored weapons now warehouse frankincense, jade, and spices worth more than the armaments they replaced. Loading docks designed for siege engines now accommodate camel trains carrying goods that weigh less but cost more than bronze cannons. In the corner shrine of the Yumen barracks, Sergeant Liu burns sandalwood incense before a bronze Guanyin statue, while the Persian trader Rashid kneels beside him, whispering Zoroastrian fire prayers to the same flickering flame. Their languages differ, their gods bear different names, but the smoke rises from both their offerings toward the same desert sky. Neither man understands the other's theology, yet both understand the need for supernatural protection in a place where profit and danger sleep in the same tent. The Syrian merchant Marcus clutches his chest outside the jade warehouse, his face turning purple as unfamiliar Chinese wine burns through his Mediterranean constitution. His Sogdian translator shouts for assistance, but the garrison physician treats only military personnel, leaving Marcus to die from his prosperity, while his cargo of Damascus steel sits unguarded. 3 days later, bandits kill his business partner during a raid on the return caravan, understanding that silk merchants carry more portable wealth than military patrols. At the mountain pass trading post of Lulan, plague spreads through the dormitories, where Parthian horse dealers share sleeping quarters with Kushan gem merchants and Chinese tea traders. The disease comes from someone's hometown, perhaps Antioch, perhaps Chang'an, perhaps Bactria, but it recognizes no ethnic boundaries as it moves through lungs that breathe the same recycled air. Within 2 weeks, 17 traders lie buried in the desert sand, their goods distributed among survivors who lack the commercial networks to profit from the inheritance. The Sogdian caravan master Kang Ju freezes to death in a mountain pass he attempted to cross during winter, because his commercial ambitions drove him beyond the seasonal limitations that military commanders understand. His frozen corpse clutches a contract for spring silk delivery to Samarkand. written in 3 languages but useless against the physics of altitude and temperature. Local garrison troops find his body when the snow melts, along with 2 camels and a fortune in jade that no one survives to claim. By 320 AD, the mathematical impossibility becomes undeniable. The defensive installations consume less imperial revenue than the commercial activities they enable generate in taxes. The military tail is wagging the economic dog. Yet no emperor can admit that barriers built to protect Chinese civilization have instead created a hybrid frontier culture that is economically superior to pure Chinese isolation, while remaining culturally incomprehensible to Confucian orthodoxy. On the beacon tower at Red Mountain Pass, the signal fire operator Huang sleeps through his night watch while below him. Persian merchants lead camel trains through the darkness, their bells muffled with cloth to avoid detection by tax collectors. The beacon that should warn of approaching threats now serves as a lighthouse guiding smugglers past customs checkpoints. Wang's snoring mingles with the soft shuffle of padded camel feet and the whispered negotiations of men who have learned to profit from the empire's military infrastructure by ignoring its original purpose entirely. Broken pottery crunches under bare feet as the monk Huang clears debris from what will become his meditation hall. The gatehouse at Juyong Pass still bears scorch marks from the fire that consumed its wooden fixtures 3 months ago, when competing Chinese armies fought each other for control of stones originally built to keep foreigners out. The year is 348 AD, and prayer flags now flutter between cracked columns, where customs officials once examined silk bound for Western markets, their bright colors masking the smell of old smoke and older blood. The transformation began when General Cao Cao marched his troops along the ramparts near Luoyang in 208 AD, not to watch for nomadic raiders, but to position artillery against Chinese enemies approaching from the south. The psychological shift proved more devastating than any barbarian invasion. Walls built to protect Chinese civilization became weapons pointed at Chinese hearts. Soldiers who had trained to defend their homeland found themselves manning positions designed to kill their countrymen, creating a spiritual crisis that no military manual could address. Brother Kumarajiva arrives at the abandoned fortress of Yanmen with 17 refugee families, whose villages burned during the latest succession war between the Jin dynasty and various tribal confederation. The fortress, designed to house 200 soldiers, now shelters 80 civilians who have never held weapons, but understand that stone walls offer better protection than wooden farmhouses. Children play among rusted spearheads while their mothers cook millet porridge in bronze helmets, transforming instruments of war into domestic necessities through the simple mathematics of survival. In the meditation courtyard that once served as a weapons storage facility, Kumarajiva teaches the Heart Sutra to former soldiers whose minds cannot escape the memory of using these same stones as cover while shooting crossbow bolts at men who spoke the same language, worshipped the same ancestors, and sang the same songs. The sutra speaks of emptiness, but these men understand fullness, the terrible completeness of walls that work too well, protecting nothing by turning protection itself into aggression. The refugee camp at Datong reveals the infrastructure's unintended adaptability. Barracks designed for military discipline now accommodate extended families who hang privacy curtains between sleeping alcoves and establish communal kitchens in former armories. The wells that once supplied garrison troops now serve civilians who have learned to ration water, not for siege defense, but for drought survival. Latrines built for soldiers now serve grandmothers and children who modify military efficiency to meet domestic needs through improvisation that would astound the original architects. During the winter of 383 AD, the warlord Shilei attempts to hold the Jiayuguan fortress against armies approaching from 3 directions. Discovering that walls designed to face threats from one cardinal direction become death traps when enemies approach from multiple angles. His men crouch behind parapets that protect them from northern arrows, while exposing them to southern crossbow bolts. Learning that perfect defense against external threats can create perfect vulnerability to internal warfare. The fortress falls in 2 days, not through siege engineering, but through the simple geometry of surrounded space. The Battle of Fei River transforms the psychological relationship between Chinese troops and their own fortifications. Lieutenant Wang Ming watches from a rampart embrasure as friendly forces advance from the east, while hostile forces advance from the west, both flying banners that claim legitimacy from the same imperial traditions. His crossbow points alternately at enemies and allies, as the political situation changes hourly, creating a tactical paralysis that leaves him motionless while battle rages below. When the shooting stops, Huang discovers he has fired no arrows because he could never determine which targets deserved death. In the cooking fires that now burn in former guard rooms, refugee women prepare meals from ingredients that would horrify their grandmothers. Leather armor boiled into soup, dried military rations stretched with foraged grass, horse fodder ground into flour when grain supplies fail. The Confucian ideal of proper food preparation dissolves under the practical requirements of keeping children alive in spaces designed for men who expected regular supply deliveries from a functioning state that no longer exists. Brother Ming establishes a scriptorum in the underground chambers beneath Shanhai Pass, where Buddhist manuscripts copied by lamplight replace military records that documented threats which no longer matter, because the empire that perceived them has ceased to exist. His monks work surrounded by rotting wooden shields and rusted blade fragments, creating beautiful illuminated texts about compassion while sitting among the detritus of systematic violence. The irony does not escape him, but the work continues, because someone must preserve wisdom through the chaos. The plague outbreak at Juanhua demonstrates how military architecture fails civilian populations. Ventilation systems designed to remove smoke from signal fires cannot handle the body heat and breath of refugee families, crowded into spaces calculated for smaller numbers of healthier people. Disease spreads through communal sleeping areas where privacy is impossible and isolation is impractical. Within 3 weeks, 47 refugees die from illnesses that would not have killed them in their destroyed villages, learning too late that survival requires more than shelter. Tribal chieftains who once fought Chinese armies now hire Chinese refugees to maintain fortifications against other tribal chieftains who also hire Chinese refugees, creating employment opportunities in the ruins of empire. Former imperial soldiers teach former tribal enemies how to repair masonry damaged during their own battles, then teach former tribal enemies how to defend against former imperial soldiers who now serve different tribal employers. The result is technical competence without political coherence, as military expertise becomes a commodity divorced from any consistent strategic purpose. At Gubeiku, the merchant Lu Wei leads a caravan through gates that change political ownership weekly, depending on which warlord currently controls access fees. His trade goods include Buddhist sutras written in Chinese characters, Confucian classics copied in Sanskrit, and military manuals translated into tribal dialects for commanders who can read but not govern. The intellectual confusion mirrors the political chaos. Wisdom traditions meant to provide stability instead contribute to the proliferation of competing authorities who cannot agree on fundamental principles of order. The psychological collapse reveals itself most clearly in the abandoned watchtowers, where former guards return as hermits, not to resume military duties, but to practice solitary meditation in spaces that once required constant communication with distant commanders. These men have learned that the isolation they once endured as professional necessity can become spiritual practice when divorced from institutional purpose. They light fires not to signal military information, but to warm themselves during personal contemplation of a world that no longer makes strategic sense. Brother Huang completes his commentary on the Lotus Sutra, while refugees sleep in the chamber below his cell, their breathing creating a human rhythm that replaces the martial drumbeats that once echoed through these corridors. His writing describes the Buddha's teaching that all phenomena are interdependent, that nothing exists in isolation from everything else. Outside his window, the wall continues its journey across the landscape, connecting nothing to nothing, protecting no one from anyone, a monument to the interdependence of human ambition and human failure. Steam rises from the brick kilns at Tang as Master Chen examines fired clay blocks still warm from their 12-hour baking cycle. Each block bears the potter's stamp, not for quality control, but for post-mortem execution, should the finished section collapse within 5 years of completion. The year is 604 AD, and Emperor Yang has decreed that China's new barriers will rise in 5 years, rather than the 10 that engineers recommend, demanding innovations in materials and methods that push ceramic technology beyond safe limits, while pushing human endurance beyond survivable ones. Huang spreads architectural drawings across lacquered tables in the Daming Palace, calculating tonnages and distances with the precision of a merchant and the ruthlessness of a tyrant. His engineers report that proper construction requires 200,000 workers over 10 years. His reply transforms mathematics into mass murder, 1 million workers over 5 years, working through winters that kill and summers that exhaust, because political necessity transcends physical possibility and imperial ambition supersedes human limitation. In the worker dormitories at Yanmen, 60 men sleep on wooden platforms designed for 30, their bodies generating enough heat to melt frost on the interior walls, while their breath creates condensation that drips onto straw bedding that never dries completely. The overcrowding is intentional. Imperial planners calculated that housing twice the intended number reduces construction time by 40%, though it increases disease transmission by rates they chose not to calculate, because epidemiology serves no political purpose when deadlines matter more than death rates. The revolutionary brick-facing technique requires kilns that burn continuously for weeks, consuming forests faster than nature can replace them while producing ceramic materials stronger than previous rammed earth construction. In the furnace chambers beneath Juyong Pass, workers feed timber into fires that reach temperatures hot enough to fuse sand into glass, their faces blistering from heat while their lungs fill with smoke that tastes of burning oak and human sweat. The innovation succeeds brilliantly at creating superior building materials while killing the people who create them. Foreman Liu Wei distributes daily food rations that contain fewer calories than the work requires, creating systematic starvation designed to motivate faster completion through the logic that hungry workers hurry while fed workers rest. Millet porridge thinned with water constitutes breakfast, lunch, and dinner, supplemented by whatever insects or grass workers can forage during rest periods that grow shorter each week as construction falls behind schedule. The mathematics are simple. Workers who cannot maintain adequate nutrition cannot maintain adequate work pace, but workers who die can be replaced more easily than schedules can be extended. Underground construction at Gubeku reveals the project's most dangerous innovation, tunneling through solid rock to create foundations deep enough to support walls 30 feet high and 20 feet thick. Workers descend wooden ladders into excavation sites where cave-ins kill more people than enemy armies ever did, their bodies remaining entombed in construction sites that become their unmarked graves. The technique produces unprecedented structural stability while consuming human lives at unprecedented rates. In the brick workshops that operate throughout winter nights, workers handle ceramic materials that burn their hands while their feet freeze in workshops heated only around the kilns. The temperature differential creates respiratory illnesses that spread through dormitories faster than medical knowledge can treat them, while the chemical fumes from glazing processes poison workers who lack understanding of toxicology, but understand perfectly that continued work means continued eating, while stopped work means immediate execution. The Grand Canal construction proceeds simultaneously with wall construction, creating competing demands for the same workers who must choose between drowning in construction accidents or dying from exhaustion in stone-moving operations that require human labor, because mechanical solutions would take longer to implement than human replacements take to recruit. Water management and land management merge into a single project that consumes human resources at rates that exceed the empire's population replacement capacity. Huang supervises construction at Shanhai Pass while calculating privately that current death rates will kill every worker within 18 months, requiring constant recruitment that drains agricultural regions of men needed for food production that feeds the recruitment pools. His ledger records a death spiral disguised as architectural progress. The more workers die, the more workers are needed. The fewer farmers remain to feed the workers, the faster the remaining workers die from malnutrition. Rebellion begins in the workshops rather than the construction sites, initiated by ceramic specialists who understand that their technical expertise makes them irreplaceable until their expertise is transferred to replacement specialists, recruited from pottery villages that have already contributed their strongest men to death quotas. Master potters teach their techniques to teenage apprentices while planning revolts that must succeed before the apprentices become competent enough to make the masters expendable. The uprising at Darming spreads from construction site to construction site as workers discover that dying slowly from starvation hurts more than dying quickly from combat, while offering less chance of taking imperial overseers with them into death. Wooden construction equipment becomes weapons as scaffolding poles transform into spears, and bronze measuring tools become daggers in the hands of men who have learned that cooperation with impossible demands leads to certain death, while rebellion against impossible demands offers possible survival. Li Yuan arrives from Taiyuan with orders to suppress the rebellion, using methods that preserve workers alive enough to continue construction. Discovering that the contradiction inherent in those orders reflects the contradiction inherent in the entire project. Workers healthy enough to fight are workers healthy enough to work, but workers too weak to rebel are workers too weak to build. His military solution becomes political impossibility as the requirements for successful suppression undermine the requirements for successful construction. The psychological transformation proves more devastating than the physical casualties. Workers who survive learn that imperial authority can demand the impossible and execute those who fail to achieve it, creating a permanent crisis of legitimacy that undermines not just the current project, but the entire concept of governmental competence. Subjects who witness systematic failure, disguised as systematic success, develop permanent suspicion of official claims that will poison political relationships for generations. Master Chen collapses beside his kiln after working 36 consecutive hours, his heart stopping from exhaustion while his hands still hold the mold for bricks that will outlast the dynasty that demanded their creation. His body is cremated in the furnace that killed him, the ashes mixed with mortar that incorporates his death into the structure that caused it, creating a monument that embeds its own victims into its own foundation with efficiency that would impress accountants if it did not horrify human beings. Weeds grow through cracks in the stone pavement, where Emperor Taizong walks with the Tibetan ambassador Songtsen Gampo, discussing marriage alliances rather than military preparations. The year is 641 AD, and the abandoned fortress at Yumen Pass has become a diplomatic meeting ground where former enemies negotiate trade agreements in courtyards designed for weapons storage. Princess Wencheng will travel to Lhasa carrying Chinese silks and Buddhist sutras instead of armies carrying Chinese spears and siege engines, proving that marriage contracts cost less than military contracts while achieving superior political results. The transformation began when court advisors calculated that maintaining frontier fortifications consumed more imperial revenue than diplomatic subsidies required, leading to the revolutionary discovery that buying allies costs less than building barriers against enemies. Tang gold flows westward to tribal chieftains who agree to police their own territories against raiders, creating security partnerships that function more reliably than static fortifications while generating grateful allies rather than resentful subjects forced to labor on projects they cannot benefit from. In the poetry workshops established in former guard towers at Jiayuguan, Li Bai composes verses about frontier landscapes, while merchants brew tea using water from wells originally dug for military garrisons. The cultural flowering happens because resources no longer consumed by construction projects can support scholars, artists, and philosophers who transform abandoned military installations into centers of learning that attract talent from across the known world. Confucian academies replace weapons workshops, while Buddhist monasteries expand into chambers once reserved for military supplies. Brother Xuanzang prepares for his journey to India from the monastery at Huang, loading manuscripts onto camels in courtyards where previous generations loaded crossbow bolts onto supply wagons. His pilgrimage will bring Sanskrit texts back through the same gates that once filtered out foreign influences, demonstrating how abandoned defensive positions become cultural exchange points when political confidence replaces military anxiety. The monk carries imperial letters of introduction rather than military escorts, protected by diplomatic immunity rather than armed guards. The diplomatic revolution reaches its pinnacle during negotiations with Tibetan delegates in the former command center at Shanhai Pass. Chinese negotiators offer princess marriages, trade privileges, and territorial concessions in exchange for peace agreements that eliminate the need for expensive garrison maintenance, while creating political relationships that serve both parties better than military domination served either. Tea ceremonies replace military briefings, while poetry readings replace tactical planning sessions. Cultural confidence generates economic prosperity that military preparedness never achieved. Markets flourish in former barracks as Persian traders establish permanent residences in buildings designed for temporary military occupation. The commercial success vindicates imperial policy, while creating prosperity that funds expanded diplomatic activities, educational institutions, and artistic projects that enhance Tang prestige more effectively than military victories enhanced previous dynastic reputations. In 751 AD, The Battle of Talas demonstrates the limits of cultural confidence when Tang forces encounter Arab armies equipped with superior tactics and technologies that Chinese diplomacy cannot neutralize. General Gao Xianzhi discovers that military preparedness remains necessary even when diplomatic solutions work brilliantly for most problems. But the lesson arrives too late to prevent a defeat that reveals vulnerabilities created by decades of military neglect disguised as political sophistication. The scholar Wang Xuanche records Tang territorial expansion through diplomatic annexation rather than military conquest, documenting how cultural influence spreads more efficiently than military occupation, while lasting longer than temporary battlefield victories. His chronicles describe an empire that grows through attraction rather than compulsion, drawing neighboring peoples into Chinese cultural orbit through demonstrated superiority in arts, technologies, and governmental systems rather than demonstrated superiority in violence and intimidation. Yet prosperity creates overconfidence that breeds strategic blindness. The Anlushan rebellion erupts in 755 AD, when General Anlushan marches from his northeastern command toward Chang'an with 150,000 troops, discovering that an empire confident enough to abandon frontier fortifications has also abandoned the domestic security preparations necessary to prevent internal military revolts. The capital falls because its defenders assumed that cultural superiority guaranteed political stability. Panic spreads through court circles as ministers realize that diplomatic solutions work only when backed by military capabilities that they have allowed to atrophy through decades of budget reductions justified by cultural confidence. Emperor Xuanzong flees the capital, while his advisors discover that buying loyalty from external enemies means nothing when internal enemies cannot be bought at any price because they want power rather than payments. At the Tibetan frontier, King Songtsen Gampo exploits Tang domestic chaos by reclaiming territories previously ceded through diplomatic agreements, demonstrating that political concessions made from positions of strength become permanent losses when strength disappears. Tibetan armies encounter no resistance at mountain passes, where Chinese garrisons were withdrawn, because diplomatic marriages supposedly made military presence unnecessary. The emergency reconstruction begins at Juyong Pass, where Chinese engineers work frantically to restore fortifications abandoned 50 years earlier, discovering that stone walls deteriorate faster than political memories when maintenance is deferred indefinitely. Workers dig foundation trenches in courtyards where poets once recited verses, learning that cultural confidence provides no protection against military realities that never disappeared despite being ignored. In the pottery workshops hastily established to produce construction materials, Master Chen's grandson reproduces the ceramic innovations his grandfather died creating, working under emergency conditions that kill workers through haste rather than systematic cruelty. The irony is perfect. Tang cultural achievements depend upon resources freed by abandoning construction projects that subsequent military necessities force them to resume at even greater human cost. The psychological trauma proves more devastating than the military defeats. Chinese intellectuals who celebrated cultural superiority must confront the possibility that their civilization's greatest achievements cannot survive without the military preparations they learned to despise as barbaric necessities that enlightened societies transcend. The discovery that culture requires protection destroys the illusion that culture provides protection. Li Bai writes his final frontier poems from the restored watchtower at Yumen Pass, where diplomatic meeting rooms have become military command centers again, and tea ceremonies have been replaced by tactical briefings. His verses mourn not the return of military necessity, but the loss of innocence that believed human civilization could transcend the ancient patterns of conflict and preparation that define political existence regardless of cultural sophistication. Silver ingots clank against each other as the treasurer Wang Pu counts the annual tribute payment to the Liao dynasty in the imperial counting house at Kaifeng. The year is 1005 AD, and mathematics has replaced masonry as China's preferred method of frontier security. 100,000 taels of silver and 200,000 bolts of silk purchase more reliable peace than stone barriers ever provided, while costing substantially less than the human labor that previous dynasties sacrificed to construction projects that frequently failed to prevent the invasions they were built to stop. Emperor Taizu commissioned detailed cost analyses that revealed the economic absurdity of traditional approaches to security. His accountants calculated that maintaining military garrisons costs 40% more than tribute payments, while providing 60% less reliable results, leading to the revolutionary discovery that buying enemies works better than building against them. The imperial treasury now funds Liao, luxury consumption, rather than Chinese construction mortality, creating diplomatic relationships that serve both parties better than military confrontation served either. In the hydraulic engineering workshops along the Yellow River, master craftsman Li Chun designs water management systems that transform natural waterways into defensive obstacles more effective than artificial stone constructions. His wooden models demonstrate how controlled flooding can create temporary barriers that appear and disappear according to military necessity, while permanent installations remain vulnerable to siege techniques that circumvent their intended function. Rivers defend more intelligently than walls, because water adapts to circumstances while stone merely endures them. The philosophical transformation reaches deeper than strategic calculations. In the Confucian academies that flourish, because resources once consumed by construction now fund education, scholar Zhu Xi teaches that superior cultures defend themselves through demonstrated excellence rather than physical intimidation. His students learn that attracting voluntary submission through cultural superiority costs less and lasts longer than compelling involuntary submission through military dominance, creating governmental relationships that strengthen rather than drain imperial resources. Commercial prosperity validates the new approach, as trade revenues exceed tribute payments by margins that would have funded decades of traditional construction, while generating voluntary compliance that military coercion never achieved. In the merchant guilds of Hangzhou, traders calculate profit margins on goods sold to the same Liao customers whose ancestors' previous dynasties died fighting, demonstrating that commercial relationships transform enemies into business partners more efficiently than military relationships transform enemies into corpses. Yet the system's sophistication contains its own vulnerabilities. In 1115 AD, the Yurshan tribes that became the Jin dynasty demonstrate military capabilities that neither tribute payments nor commercial relationships can neutralize. Their cavalry techniques prove superior to both Chinese infantry tactics and Chinese diplomatic strategies, forcing the discovery that some problems require military solutions, regardless of how expensive and unreliable military solutions might be compared to economic alternatives. The siege of Kaifeng in 1126 AD reveals the consequences of strategic sophistication that neglected tactical preparation. Emperor Huizong and his son, Emperor Qinzong, negotiate desperately with Jin commanders who understand that military superiority makes diplomatic arrangements unnecessary, while Chinese ministers discover that decades of successful tribute diplomacy provided no preparation for opponents who prefer conquest to compensation. The Jingkang incident destroys both emperors and the illusion that cultural superiority guarantees political survival. Empress Dowager Ming attempts to organize capital defense using civilian officials who understand taxation better than fortification. Discovering that administrative competence provides limited assistance when administrative centers require physical protection, that was deliberately neglected because physical protection seemed unnecessary. Courtiers, accustomed to managing tribute payments through bureaucratic procedures, find themselves managing artillery bombardments through military procedures they never learned because they never expected to need them. The southern flight begins at Yangzhou, where Prince Zhaogo establishes the southern Song dynasty, with territorial ambitions reduced to whatever geography the Jin dynasty chooses not to occupy. His engineers design river-based defenses, using the Yangtze waterway as a natural barrier, supplemented by naval forces rather than stone constructions, creating a hybrid system that combines geographical advantage with technological innovation, while abandoning the territorial ambitions that made previous defensive systems necessary. Admiral Han Shizhong develops naval warfare techniques specifically adapted to river fighting, where shallow waters and narrow channels favor smaller vessels with superior maneuverability over larger ships designed for open ocean combat. His fleet operates from bases hidden among river islands and marshland channels, creating mobile defensive positions that cannot be besieged, because they can relocate faster than enemy forces, can organize attacks against fixed positions. In the shipyards at Jiangkang, workers construct paddle-wheel warships powered by human labor rather than wind energy, creating vessels capable of maintaining tactical positioning regardless of weather conditions that constrain sail-powered ships to whatever directions natural forces permit. The technological innovation represents sophisticated adaptation to geographical constraints, rather than attempts to overcome geographical constraints through brute construction force. The economic calculations underlying river defense prove more complex than tribute payment mathematics. Maintaining naval forces requires constant replacement of wooden ships that rot faster than stone structures deteriorate, while training sailors costs more than training infantry, because naval skills require specialized knowledge that cannot be acquired through brief military service. Yet river defense offers strategic mobility that fixed positions inherently lack. Fireships deployed during the Battle of Tangdao demonstrate Song technological innovation applied to tactical problems that traditional approaches could not solve. Chinese engineers pack vessels with gunpowder and launch them against Jin naval formations, creating explosive weapons that destroy enemy ships while requiring minimal human crews to operate. The technique represents technological force multiplication that achieves tactical objectives without proportional increases in human casualties. The scholar official Yue Fei organizes resistance operations from river-based camps that function simultaneously as military headquarters and civil administrative centers, where the same personnel manage both combat operations and tax collection, because resource limitations prevent maintaining separate institutions for warfare and governance. His innovations create flexible administrative systems that adapt to military necessities while maintaining governmental functions that pure military organizations cannot provide. In the floating markets that develop along river defense lines, merchants sell supplies to military customers while maintaining commercial relationships with civilian populations, creating economic networks that fund defense operations through voluntary transactions rather than compulsory taxation. The system generates revenue while maintaining popular support that compulsory military service would undermine through forced participation in activities that benefit the state more than individuals. Yet internal political complications prove more threatening than external military challenges. The Jin dynasty offers peace terms that would preserve Song territorial integrity, in exchange for tribute payments that exceed current river defense costs, creating political divisions between officials who prioritize fiscal responsibility and officials who prioritize national dignity. The mathematical logic favors tribute payments while psychological considerations favor military resistance. The factional disputes reach crisis during discussions of whether to negotiate with Jin diplomats or continue military resistance that consumes resources while achieving tactical victories that do not translate into strategic advantages. Finance Minister Huang calculates that tribute costs less than warfare, while General Yue Fei argues that tribute payments confirm military weakness that invites future demands for additional territorial concessions. Emperor Gaozong attempts to balance competing recommendations by accepting tribute obligations while maintaining river defenses that demonstrate residual military capability, creating a hybrid policy that satisfies neither fiscal conservatives who want pure diplomatic solutions nor military advocates who want pure military solutions. The compromise achieves political consensus while generating strategic confusion that serves no operational purpose. The psychological adaptation to reduce territorial ambitions creates cultural transformations that compensate for political losses through intellectual achievements that previous dynasties could not afford, because their resources went to construction projects rather than educational institutions. Song scholars developed technological innovations in metallurgy, printing, and navigation that enhance Chinese capabilities while requiring fewer human sacrifices than traditional approaches to national strength demanded. In the printing workshops of Hangzhou, craftsmen produce books using movable type technology that disseminates knowledge more efficiently than oral instruction methods, creating intellectual capital that cannot be destroyed by military defeats, while providing competitive advantages that cannot be captured through territorial conquest. The technological revolution generates cultural influence that transcends political boundaries, while costing substantially less than territorial expansion. The river patrol stations from Jiangkang to Ezhou demonstrate the system's operational requirements and limitations. Soldiers rotate between floating platforms and shore installations that must be supplied through river transport networks, vulnerable to disruption during seasonal flooding that makes navigation impossible regardless of military necessity. Natural forces constrain military operations more effectively than enemy forces constrain them, creating temporal vulnerabilities that cannot be solved through increased funding or improved organization. Master shipwright Chen Yaozi constructs the paddle wheel vessels that patrol the Yangtze defense line, incorporating technological innovations that reduce crew requirements while increasing tactical capabilities, but requiring specialized maintenance knowledge that limits operational flexibility to areas where technical support remains available. The ships represent sophisticated engineering solutions that create new categories of logistical problems while solving existing categories of tactical problems. The cultural flowering continues despite territorial losses, as song artists, poets, and philosophers produce works that subsequent dynasties will consider superior to anything created during periods of greater military success. The academy at Yuelu develops educational methods that influence Chinese intellectual development for centuries, while the examination system produces administrative talent that serves governmental functions more efficiently than previous appointment methods based on family connections rather than demonstrated competence. By the early 13th century, the Southern Song had established that cultural advancement was possible amid territorial retreat, that mastery of military technique could take precedence over conquest, and that the ingenuity of technology could achieve what once demanded the sacrifice of human lives. Yet the system's ultimate vulnerability lay not in its tactical limitations, but in its dependence upon enemies who remained satisfied with tribute payments rather than territorial conquest. Smoke curls from burning tax records in the customs house at Datong, as Mongol cavalrymen use Chinese administrative documents to fuel their cooking fires. The year is 1211 AD, and Genghis Khan has discovered that stone barriers designed to stop armies become irrelevant when armies refuse to attack them directly. His horsemen flow around fortifications like water around rocks, striking supply lines and administrative centers, while garrison troops wait uselessly behind walls for sieges that never come. The transformation begins when the Great Khan realizes that Chinese defensive strategy depends upon predictable enemy behavior. Raiders approaching barriers, attempting to breach them, and accepting battle on terms favorable to defenders. Mongol tactical doctrine reverses these assumptions by treating walls as geographical features to be bypassed rather than military obstacles to be overcome. The result revolutionizes warfare by making expensive fortifications strategically worthless, regardless of their tactical effectiveness. In the garrison kitchen at Juyong Pass, Chinese soldiers prepare meals for a siege that enters its third month, while Mongol raiders attack grain warehouses 50 miles behind their position. The psychological warfare proves more devastating than physical combat. Defenders who cannot defend anything except their immediate position discover that their strategic purpose has disappeared, even when their tactical capabilities remain intact. They man walls that protect nothing because the war happens everywhere except where they are. General Jebe demonstrates the new warfare during his campaign against the Jin dynasty by dividing his forces into groups that attack simultaneously from directions that no single fortification can address. His tactical innovation eliminates the psychological advantage that walls provide defenders, who must now worry about threats approaching from angles their defenses cannot cover. The result transforms confident garrison troops into anxious men who understand that their walls protect them from some dangers while exposing them to others. The siege of Zhongdu reveals the economic futility of traditional defensive thinking. When Mongol forces surround the Jin capital, not to capture it, but to starve it into surrender, without wasting lives or time on direct assault. Chinese engineers, who spent decades perfecting wall construction techniques, discover that their expertise becomes meaningless when enemies possess sufficient patience to wait for hunger to accomplish what violence cannot. The city falls through administrative collapse rather than military defeat. Chinese military advisors captured during the Zhongdu campaign provide Mongol commanders with detailed intelligence about the defensive psychology that makes traditional Chinese warfare predictable and therefore defeatable. Engineer Yelu Chukai explains to Ogedei Khan how Chinese tactical doctrine depends upon enemies who attack fortifications rather than ignore them, creating vulnerabilities that nomadic warfare can exploit through strategic patience combined with tactical mobility. The bureaucratic transformation happens more gradually than the military transformation, but proves more significant in its long-term consequences. In the administrative offices at Karakoram, Chinese scholars teach Mongol clerks how to manage taxation systems that fund governmental operations more efficiently than tribute extraction methods that previous nomadic confederations employed. The result creates a hybrid system that combines Mongol political control with Chinese administrative expertise. Liu Bingzhong adapts Chinese governmental procedures to serve Mongol strategic priorities, discovering that administrative systems designed for sedentary populations can support nomadic governmental structures when properly modified to accommodate different political assumptions about territory, loyalty, and authority. His innovations create bureaucratic methods that serve Mongol rulers, while utilizing Chinese expertise that would otherwise remain unavailable to nomadic governmental systems. The psychological collapse of Chinese defensive confidence happens faster than the military collapse of Chinese defensive capabilities. Garrison commanders who spent their careers preparing for siege warfare find themselves strategically irrelevant, even when their tactical preparations remain perfectly adequate for the types of combat that no longer occur. The result destroys military morale more effectively than battlefield defeats because it eliminates the sense of purpose that motivated defensive service. In the record offices at Yanjing, Chinese bureaucrats continue maintaining administrative systems for Mongol supervisors who understand that governmental continuity requires institutional expertise, regardless of who exercises political authority. The practical requirements of taxation, transportation, and communication transcend ethnic differences between rulers and subjects, creating cooperative relationships based on mutual necessity rather than cultural compatibility. The architectural transformation reflects the strategic transformation as Mongol administrators repurpose defensive installations to serve governmental functions rather than military purposes. Watchtowers become signal stations for administrative communication, while barracks become offices for tax collectors who need secure facilities for record storage. The physical structures remain unchanged, while their functional purposes adapt to new political realities. Khitan administrator Yelu Chukai establishes schools in former garrison facilities where Chinese teachers instruct Mongol students in administrative techniques, mathematical procedures, and written communication methods that nomadic education systems could not provide. The intellectual exchange creates cultural synthesis that serves Mongol governmental needs while preserving Chinese educational traditions that would otherwise disappear under purely nomadic political arrangements. The resistance movements that emerged during the 1220s demonstrate how Chinese military thinking adapts slowly to Mongol tactical innovations, with traditional commanders continuing to rely on defensive strategies that Mongol warfare has made obsolete. Jin generals attempt to organize conventional military responses to unconventional military challenges, discovering that traditional tactical excellence provides minimal advantage against enemies who refuse to engage in traditional tactical combat. General Wanyan Heda attempts to coordinate multi-garrison defensive operations that would concentrate Chinese military strength at strategic points, but discovers that Mongol strategic mobility makes such concentrations impossible to achieve, because enemy forces relocate faster than Chinese forces can organize coordinated responses. The failure demonstrates how tactical competence becomes strategically useless when operational assumptions prove incorrect. The commercial transformation accompanies the military transformation as Mongol political control creates trade opportunities that Chinese defensive policies had previously prevented. Merchants who formerly paid customs duties to Chinese officials now pay similar fees to Mongol administrators who maintain commercial infrastructure, while eliminating the territorial restrictions that limited trade routes to politically approved channels. In the market squares of occupied cities, Persian traders conduct business using Mongol political guarantees that provide more reliable commercial protection than Chinese military guarantees provided, demonstrating how political stability matters more than ethnic identity for commercial purposes. The practical requirements of trade create economic relationships that transcend cultural differences between various populations under Mongol authority. Yet the human cost of the transformation equals the human cost of previous military campaigns, while affecting different populations through different methods. Mongol warfare kills fewer soldiers during battles, but more civilians during aftermath, as traditional Chinese administrative systems collapse faster than Mongol administrative systems can replace them. The result creates temporary governmental vacuums that generate chaos until hybrid institutions develop operational capacity. The famine at Kaifeng during the final siege demonstrates how rapid political transformation disrupts agricultural systems that require stable governmental support for irrigation maintenance, crop distribution, and seasonal labor coordination. Political change happens faster than agricultural adaptation, creating food shortages that kill more people than military combat kills while affecting populations that never participate in warfare. The Mongol victory over northern China by 1234 AD demonstrated that defensive positions rooted in immobility cannot withstand a strategic mindset that transforms geographic hindrances into problems of maneuver. The walls remain intact while their strategic purpose disappears, creating monuments to military thinking that could not adapt quickly enough to survive contact with superior strategic innovation. The Ming didn't just rebuild the wall, they built a stone dragon that ate 1 million lives. Brick dust covers the hands of Master Mason Lu as he carves his name into a ceramic block destined for the northern ramparts, knowing that Imperial inspectors will execute him if this section collapses within 5 years of completion. The year is 1368 AD, and Emperor Huang has decreed that China's humiliation under foreign rule will never happen again, demanding barriers built from materials that outlast dynasties rather than crumble under the first serious military pressure they encounter. The trauma of Mongol domination drives construction decisions that prioritize permanence over human survival. In the planning chambers at Nanjing, General Xu Da calculates that stone and brick construction requires 3 times more workers than earth construction, while lasting 10 times longer, creating mathematics that sacrifice present populations to protect future generations from experiencing the shame that current populations remember too clearly to accept repetition. Conscription quotas arrive in farming villages like tax assessments, demanding 1 adult male from every 3 households to serve 3-year terms that frequently become permanent assignments when workers die faster than replacements can be trained. Village headmen draw lots to determine which families lose their primary laborers, creating community divisions that persist after the selected men disappear into construction sites that most never return from. The kilns at Badaling operate continuously through winter months that freeze workers' breath while they feed timber into furnaces hot enough to vitrify clay, producing ceramic materials stronger than natural stone, but requiring human endurance beyond natural limits. Workers sleep in shifts beside furnaces that provide warmth and ensure continuous production, their bodies generating enough heat to prevent ceramic materials from cracking during cooling processes that determine structural integrity. Standardization becomes systematic execution as imperial engineers establish uniform specifications that eliminate regional variations in construction techniques while creating uniform methods for identifying responsibility when sections fail structural tests. Each brick bears its maker's mark. Each stone course identifies its supervisor. Each completed section records its completion date with precision that enables post-mortem investigations when geological stress or enemy action reveals construction deficiencies. The rotational labor system brings fresh workers to replace exhausted ones every season, creating knowledge transfer problems when experienced workers die before training replacements in specialized techniques that require months to master. Apprentice masons learn mortar mixing ratios from masters whose malnutrition affects their judgment, while apprentice stonecutters inherit tools from workers whose deaths provide the only promotion opportunities available in assignments that offer no other advancement possibilities. Life is spent like fuel in the relentless labor of carrying heavy stones across mountains stripped of passable roads. Teams of 12 men transport materials that mechanical devices could move more efficiently, but mechanical solutions require time to implement, while human solutions require only recruitment quotas that administrators can fulfill immediately through expanded conscription. In the workers' compounds at Juyong Pass, 8 men share sleeping space designed for 4. Their combined body heat preventing hypothermia during mountain winters, while creating conditions that accelerate disease transmission among populations whose nutrition levels cannot support immune system functions adequate for resisting infections that spread through overcrowded housing facilities. The quality control system operates through fear rather than incentive, as foremen who accept substandard work face the same execution penalties that await workers who produce it. Inspection procedures involve destructive testing that determines structural adequacy by attempting to destroy completed sections, with failure resulting in capital punishment for everyone involved in construction, regardless of their specific roles or individual competence levels. Liuji adapts governmental procedures to support construction operations that consume resources at rates exceeding agricultural production capacity, creating taxation systems that extract materials and labor from populations already stressed by conscription quotas. His administrative innovations efficiently organize systematic exploitation while maintaining governmental functions that prevent complete social collapse during resource extraction that approaches economic sustainability limits. The winter construction protocols require workers to continue operations through weather conditions that make effective work impossible while making survival difficult, producing construction progress that satisfies political requirements while killing workers through exposure to environmental conditions that safety considerations would prohibit if safety considerations mattered more than completion schedules. Medical facilities in worker compounds treat injuries caused by construction accidents while ignoring malnutrition-related illnesses that affect larger numbers of workers, because accident treatment demonstrates governmental concern, while malnutrition treatment would require food allocation, changes that would slow construction progress by improving worker health enough to reduce management efficiency through increased survival rates. Secondary industries develop around construction sites as local entrepreneurs establish businesses that serve worker needs while extracting additional resources from populations that lack disposable income for non-essential purchases. Tavern owners sell diluted alcohol to workers whose wages cannot afford full-strength drinks, while food vendors offer meals containing protein sources that would be unacceptable under normal circumstances, but become acceptable under conditions where any nutrition improves survival probability. The engineering innovations that enable stone construction require specialized knowledge that previous earth construction techniques did not demand, creating educational bottlenecks when expert craftsmen die faster than apprentices can acquire equivalent skills. Advanced masonry techniques disappear when masters die before transferring knowledge to successors, forcing rediscovery of methods that previous generations had perfected through trial and error processes that consumed additional human resources. In provinces where official labor demands exceed what the population can provide without undermining the agricultural production required to sustain fiscal extraction, regional resistance emerges as an inevitable response. Local officials face impossible choices between meeting labor quotas and maintaining economic productivity, with imperial punishment awaiting officials who fail at either obligation, while no officials receive recognition for achieving both successfully. A drive for architectural consistency produces a shared aesthetic, but also shared fragility, since the same construction practices repeated everywhere yield the same structural breakdowns under the same pressures. Sections built using identical specifications fail simultaneously during earthquakes or extreme weather events, requiring simultaneous repairs that overwhelm available resources, while demonstrating that standardization optimizes efficiency at the cost of resilience. Administrative records maintained at construction sites document systematic waste of human resources through procedures designed to maximize political compliance rather than operational effectiveness. Bureaucratic requirements consume administrative effort that could improve worker conditions if redirected toward logistical optimization, but political considerations require documentation that serves imperial oversight rather than construction efficiency. The psychological transformation of worker populations creates permanent changes in social relationships. As families adjust to male absence rates that exceed wartime casualty rates while lasting longer than military campaigns, communities develop alternative economic arrangements when traditional household structures become impossible to maintain, creating social innovations that preserve essential functions while adapting to demographic changes caused by systematic labor extraction. The reconstruction undertaken by the Ming produced structures that would endure for centuries, but their creation demanded human effort on a scale comparable only to the massive campaigns of earlier ages. The stone barriers that tourists admire today embed the deaths of 600,000 workers in foundations that support structures designed to prevent future generations from experiencing the political trauma that motivated their construction. Ceramic stamps press into soft clay as Potter Chen marks each brick with symbols that will identify him after his death, should imperial inspectors discover structural failures in sections he constructed. The year is 1570 AD, and systematic quality control has transformed construction into a lottery where winning means survival and losing means posthumous execution of craftsmen whose families inherit their shame along with their debts. The perfected system operates with mechanical precision that eliminates human error through the simple expedient of eliminating humans who make errors. In the inspection chambers at Mutianyu, technical experts test brick strength by attempting to shatter samples with iron hammers, recording the names of makers whose products fail to meet specifications that require materials strong enough to support cavalry charges across rampart surfaces 20 feet above ground level. Watchtower construction at Jinshanling follows architectural patterns refined through 50 generations of trial and error, with each tower positioned exactly 2 li from its neighbors to optimize crossbow coverage while minimizing gaps in observation fields. Master builder Huang designs interior spaces that accommodate 12 soldiers, their weapons, communication equipment, and food supplies for siege conditions lasting up to 6 months without external resupply. The standardized dimensions reflect decades of experimentation with fortress architecture, walls 25 feet high and 15 feet thick, with interior passages wide enough for mounted messengers, but narrow enough for small groups to defend against larger attacking forces. Crenellations spaced at precise intervals provide archer positions that maximize defensive firepower, while minimizing exposure to enemy projectiles approaching from predictable angles. Underground chambers carved from bedrock store grain supplies that enable garrisons to survive. Extended isolation when enemy forces cut supply lines connecting frontier positions to agricultural regions that provide the food necessary for military operations. Storage calculations accommodate caloric requirements for defensive personnel during winter months, when local foraging becomes impossible due to weather conditions that affect both Chinese troops and potential invaders. The communication network linking watchtowers operates through signal fires that relay coded messages across distances exceeding 300 li in a single day, using smoke patterns during daylight hours and flame configurations during nighttime periods. Signal operators memorize code books that translate military intelligence into visual symbols readable by observers equipped with magnifying lenses that enable message interpretation at maximum visual distances. In the garrison kitchens at Badaling, cooks prepare meals using ingredients transported from agricultural centers located hundreds of miles from frontier positions, demonstrating logistical capabilities that enable military operations in regions where local food production cannot support the population densities required for effective territorial defense. Military nutrition science ensures that soldiers receive adequate protein and carbohydrates to maintain combat effectiveness during extended deployments. The brick manufacturing process achieves industrial scale production through specialized workshops that operate year-round to meet construction quotas that consume ceramic materials faster than traditional pottery methods could supply them. Kiln technologies perfected through systematic experimentation produce building materials with consistent strength characteristics that enable architects to calculate load-bearing requirements with mathematical precision rather than intuitive estimation. Quality control inspectors conduct destructive testing that determines structural adequacy by subjecting completed sections to stresses that exceed anticipated combat conditions, ensuring that fortifications can withstand artillery bombardment, siege equipment impact, and seismic activity that might compromise defensive effectiveness. Failed sections require complete reconstruction using materials and methods that meet revised specifications designed to prevent similar failures. The labor management system rotates workers between different construction sites to prevent the development of regional construction techniques that might compromise architectural standardization, while ensuring that specialized knowledge remains distributed among sufficient numbers of craftsmen to prevent critical skill losses when individual workers die from accidents, disease, or exhaustion-related mortality. Family housing compounds near construction sites accommodate workers' wives and children who provide domestic services that reduce the logistical burden of supplying food preparation, clothing maintenance, and medical care for construction personnel. The arrangement creates economic incentives for long-term commitment to construction projects while generating additional labor resources through family members who contribute to construction activities within their physical capabilities. Secondary walls behind primary fortifications create multiple defensive lines that force attacking armies to breach successive barriers, rather than achieving victory through single successful assaults. The layered defense concept requires additional construction resources, while providing tactical advantages that justify increased material and human costs through enhanced military effectiveness that previous single-barrier systems could not achieve. At Gubeikou, the administrative headquarters preserve meticulous records, tracking construction milestones, the rate of material use, the efficiency of laborers, and the behavior of finished structures, allowing imperial overseers to detect emerging problems before defensive strength is undermined. Bureaucratic procedures ensure accountability while providing data necessary for optimizing construction methods that balance speed, cost, durability, and defensive effectiveness. The economic impact extends throughout the empire as taxation systems extract resources necessary for frontier construction, while maintaining domestic governmental operations that provide internal security, agricultural support, and commercial regulation. Imperial revenues dedicated to barrier construction reach 40% of total governmental income during peak construction years, when military priorities override civilian infrastructure investment. At the finished stretches, ritual observances seek divine protection over walls born of human industry, yet concede that the fate of these constructions rests in the hands of supernatural forces that govern success and failure alike. Buddhist monks and Taoist priests perform blessing rituals that provide psychological comfort for military personnel, who understand that spiritual protection supplements rather than replaces tactical preparation. The medical services provided at construction sites treat injuries caused by accidents involving heavy machinery, dangerous materials, and hazardous working conditions, while providing limited treatment for illnesses that affect larger numbers of workers, but receive less attention, because illness treatment requires resources that accident treatment does not demand, while contributing less to maintaining construction productivity. Specialized craftsmen develop techniques for working with materials that require knowledge unavailable through traditional training methods, creating educational bottlenecks when expert knowledge must be transmitted to apprentices within time constraints imposed by construction schedules. Master craftsmen teach advanced techniques while continuing their own productive work, creating dual responsibilities that reduce efficiency while ensuring knowledge continuity. The transportation network supporting construction operations includes roads, bridges, and canal systems that enable movement of heavy materials across geographical obstacles that would otherwise prevent efficient resource delivery to remote construction sites. Infrastructure investment required for material transport creates permanent improvements that benefit subsequent economic development, while justifying immediate construction costs through long-term utility value. Seasonal variations in construction activity accommodate weather conditions that affect worker safety and material performance, while maintaining progress toward completion deadlines that political considerations establish, rather than technical requirements determine. Winter construction continues during months when optimal working conditions would suggest suspension of operations because political pressure for completion exceeds concern for worker welfare or construction quality. Communities subjected to long-term labor extraction undergo permanent reconfiguration of their social fabric, with psychological pressures reinforcing demographic changes that redefine family patterns, marriage arrangements, and modes of economic survival. Villages develop alternative social institutions when traditional community organizations become impossible to maintain under conditions of systematic male population depletion caused by construction conscription. "Open the gates, or we burn everything," shouts the Manchu herald from horseback beneath the walls at Shanhai Pass, while General Wu Sangui paces the ramparts above, calculating impossible mathematics. The year is 1644 AD, and China's greatest defensive achievement has become its greatest strategic liability. Behind Wu Sangui approach Li Zicheng's rebel armies, who have already burned Beijing and declared a new dynasty. Before him wait Dogon's disciplined cavalry, who promise order if he joins them, chaos if he opposes them. Wu Sangui's hands shake as he examines the bronze key that locks the eastern gate, knowing that his decision will determine whether 400 years of construction sacrifice will preserve Chinese independence or enable foreign conquest. His aide brings reports that Li Zicheng's forces have executed Wu Sangui's father and confiscated his family properties, creating personal motivations that align with strategic necessities, while eliminating the possibility of neutrality in conflicts that transcend individual preferences. Smoke rises from signal fires that carry contradictory messages along the communication network, as garrison commanders receive orders from 3 different sources claiming imperial authority. At Juyong Pass, Captain Liu burns documents that identify him as a Ming loyalist, while preparing others that declare allegiance to whichever faction proves victorious. The administrative chaos demonstrates how quickly sophisticated governmental systems collapse when political legitimacy becomes contested among competing authorities. In the weapons storage chambers beneath Gubeku, Manchu engineers examine Chinese artillery pieces with professional appreciation for technical innovations. They will adapt to serve different strategic purposes. Advisor Yelu Chukai explains to Prince Dorgon how crossbow mechanisms operate, and how signal fire networks function, transforming Chinese military expertise into Manchu administrative capabilities through voluntary cooperation that proves more efficient than forced extraction. The decisive moment arrives when Wu Sangui unlocks the Eastern Gate, while his troops lower their weapons in surrender, that saves their lives while ending Chinese political independence. Manchu cavalry flows through openings designed to keep foreign armies out, demonstrating the ultimate irony that China's greatest defensive achievement becomes the instrument of its own conquest when defended by men who choose collaboration over resistance. Dogon establishes his headquarters in the same chamber where Ming commanders once planned defensive operations, using furniture crafted by Chinese artisans to support administrative activities that serve Manchu political objectives. His secretaries translate governmental documents from Chinese into Manchu script, while maintaining administrative procedures that preserve essential governmental functions. Despite changes in political control and cultural priorities, the transformation happens gradually through personnel changes rather than institutional destruction. Chinese bureaucrats continue managing taxation, transportation, and communication systems, while reporting to Manchu supervisors, who understand that governmental effectiveness requires technical expertise, regardless of ethnic identity. Administrative continuity serves Manchu interests, while preserving Chinese careers that might otherwise disappear through political purges. At the garrison school in Datong, Master Liu teaches Chinese children to read Manchu characters, alongside traditional Chinese texts, creating educational synthesis that prepares students for governmental service under foreign rulers whose administrative needs require linguistic capabilities that previous educational systems did not emphasize. Students learn loyalty to the Qing dynasty through the same pedagogical methods that previously taught loyalty to the Ming dynasty. Brother Ming Shan adapts Buddhist ceremonies to acknowledge Manchu political authority while preserving spiritual traditions that provide community continuity during political transitions. His morning prayers include requests for the health and prosperity of Qing rulers, whose governmental policies affect Buddhist community welfare, demonstrating how religious institutions accommodate political change through theological flexibility that preserves institutional survival. Garrison Commander Shi Lang inspects the same fortifications his grandfather built while serving Ming emperors, discovering that defensive installations remain structurally sound despite serving different political purposes under foreign rulers who understand military architecture regardless of cultural differences. Stone walls defend Manchu territories as effectively as they defended Chinese territories, when maintained by soldiers whose professional competence transcends ethnic loyalties. The tribute system adapts to serve Manchu diplomatic needs as Chinese administrative personnel negotiate with tribal representatives who formerly opposed Chinese expansion but now cooperate with Manchu authority. The same bureaucratic procedures that manage Chinese foreign relations now manage Manchu foreign relations, demonstrating how governmental techniques survive political transformations that eliminate the governments that created them. Commercial activities continue through the same checkpoint facilities that previously regulated Chinese trade, as Manchu customs officials collect revenues using procedures that Chinese officials developed while serving different rulers. Persian merchants pay taxes to foreign collectors using forms written in scripts they cannot read, but the transaction processes remain familiar enough to enable continued business relationships. In the medical facility at Badaling, Chinese physicians treat Manchu soldiers using techniques learned during Ming military service, discovering that medical knowledge transcends political boundaries when human physiology remains constant despite changes in political authority. Herbal medicines and surgical procedures work equally well for treating Chinese and Manchu patients whose bodies respond identically to identical therapeutic interventions. The rotational garrison system continues operating under Manchu administration, as Chinese officers train Manchu recruits in defensive techniques, while Manchu officers teach Chinese troops cavalry tactics that improve military effectiveness through cross-cultural knowledge exchange. Professional military cooperation develops between former enemies who discover shared interests in maintaining regional security that benefits both populations. Manchu administrators adapt Chinese record-keeping systems to document governmental activities that serve Manchu political objectives while maintaining bureaucratic standards that preserve administrative efficiency. The same ledgers that recorded Ming governmental transactions now record Qing governmental transactions, using identical accounting procedures that enable financial continuity during political transition. Food production systems that supplied Ming garrisons continue supplying Qing garrisons through agricultural arrangements that remain unchanged, despite political transformations affecting governmental control. Farmers deliver grain quotas to foreign officials using transportation networks that Chinese engineers constructed, demonstrating how infrastructure investments transcend the political circumstances that motivated their creation. The judicial system adapts Manchu legal principles to Chinese social conditions, while preserving dispute resolution procedures that maintain community stability during political change. Chinese magistrates apply Qing legal codes to cases involving Chinese defendants, while Manchu magistrates handle cases involving Manchu defendants, creating parallel legal systems that serve different populations within unified administrative structures. Winter maintenance procedures continue under Manchu supervision, as Chinese workers repair fortifications using techniques perfected during Ming construction projects. Stone replacement, mortar renewal, and structural reinforcement proceed according to established schedules that preserve defensive capabilities regardless of which political authority benefits from continued fortification effectiveness. The adaptation succeeds through practical cooperation between populations whose survival depends upon maintaining governmental functions that serve essential community needs regardless of ethnic identity among governmental personnel. Chinese expertise combines with Manchu authority to create hybrid institutions that preserve valuable capabilities while serving new political objectives. Yet subtle changes accumulate as Manchu priorities gradually modify Chinese procedures in ways that reflect different cultural assumptions about governmental authority, military necessity, and territorial control. Administrative forms include additional questions about ethnic identity, while military promotion procedures favor candidates with Manchu language capabilities, creating systematic modifications that alter institutional character without destroying institutional effectiveness. Captain Wu examines patrol schedules that now include monitoring internal population movements as well as external military threats, reflecting Manchu concerns about Chinese loyalty that previous Chinese administrations did not need to address. The walls that once faced outward to monitor foreign enemies now face inward to monitor domestic subjects whose political reliability requires surveillance that previous defensive systems did not provide. Bronze keys turn in iron locks as General Wu Sangui unlocks the eastern gate at Shanhai Pass, while his aide holds a lantern that casts trembling shadows on stone carved by workers whose bones lie mixed in the mortar beneath their feet. The year is 1644 AD, and China's greatest defensive achievement is about to become the instrument of its own conquest through invitation rather than assault. "Open the gates, or we burn everything," the Manchu herald had shouted 3 hours before dawn. his voice echoing off stones that had never heard such ultimatums delivered in the barbarian tongue to Chinese defenders who possessed the power to grant them. Behind Wu Sangui's position, smoke rises from villages that Li Zicheng's rebel army burned, while advancing toward the pass with 200,000 followers, whose hatred burns hotter than nomadic rage. Because they are Chinese farmers, driven to warfare by policies that consumed their children, to build barriers against enemies who now stand invited at the threshold. Wu Sangui's hands shake as he examines reports describing Li Zicheng's treatment of captured officials, with details that turn his stomach, while clarifying his impossible choice between collaboration with rebels who torture administrators and collaboration with foreigners who promise governmental continuity. His family properties in Beijing have been confiscated, and his father executed by the rebel regime that claims to represent Chinese interests while destroying Chinese families, whose service to the previous dynasty marked them for revolutionary justice. In the guardhouse chamber, where Wu Sangui weighs his decision, maps spread across wooden tables show the strategic impossibility of fighting both armies simultaneously while defending positions that become untenable once enemies coordinate their efforts. His remaining 40,000 troops cannot defeat 4 times their number, while holding terrain that offers defensive advantages only when enemies attack directly rather than bypass strategically. The irony deepens as Prince Dorgan's diplomatic messages emphasize Manchu commitment to preserving Chinese governmental institutions, while eliminating only the royal family whose policies created the current crisis. The foreign prince presents himself as a conservative alternative to revolutionary chaos, rather than a conqueror seeking to destroy Chinese civilization, offering Wu Sangui personal survival and social stability in exchange for political cooperation. Outside the fortress gates, Li Zicheng's advance forces begin arriving at positions that force Wu Sangui's decision before tactical considerations can influence strategic calculations. The rebel army includes former Ming soldiers, whose defection demonstrates how quickly military loyalty dissolves when governmental policies become unbearable for the populations they supposedly protect, while their presence eliminates Wu Sangui's option of maintaining neutrality until circumstances clarify. Captain Liu burns documents that identify him as a Ming loyalist while preparing alternative papers that declare allegiance to whichever faction proves victorious, demonstrating administrative pragmatism that prioritizes institutional survival over political principle. His actions reflect calculations that most garrison personnel share. Professional competence matters more than dynastic loyalty when professional competence ensures personal survival. At dawn, on May 27th, 1644, the massive bronze mechanisms that secure the eastern gate groan as Wu Sangui turns the locking wheels that Chinese craftsmen designed to prevent exactly the access he now provides voluntarily. The sound of opening hinges announces the end of Chinese independence and the beginning of foreign rule that will govern the Middle Kingdom for the next 268 years, demonstrating how individual decisions can transform architectural achievements into historical ironies. Manchu cavalry flows through the opened gateway with disciplined formations that contrast sharply with Li Zicheng's chaotic retreat when faced with fresh enemies approaching from unexpected directions. The psychological impact on Chinese populations watching barbarian horsemen ride unopposed through their most sacred defensive positions creates trauma that influences Chinese identity for generations, as barriers that define the boundary between civilization and savagery lose their meaning when barbarian rulers prove more capable of maintaining civilized government. Prince Dorgan establishes his command center in the same chamber where Ming generals had planned defensive operations against his people. using furniture crafted by Chinese artisans to coordinate administrative activities that serve Manchu political objectives. His secretaries begin translating governmental documents from Chinese into Manchu script, while preserving bureaucratic procedures that maintain essential governmental functions despite revolutionary changes in political control. Chinese bureaucrats report to their new Manchu supervisors in the same offices where they had served Ming administrators, discovering that technical expertise transcends ethnic identity when governmental effectiveness requires knowledge that cannot be acquired quickly enough to replace experienced personnel. Administrative continuity serves Manchu interests while preserving Chinese careers that contribute essential capabilities to foreign rulers who understand that conquest requires cooperation. In the treasury chambers, where Ming officials had counted silver destined for construction projects, Manchu accountants now calculate revenues that will fund different governmental priorities while utilizing taxation systems that Chinese administrators developed and continue operating under foreign supervision. The same ledgers record transactions that serve new political purposes while maintaining bureaucratic standards that enable fiscal continuity. Captain Chen examines the watchtower rosters that now include monitoring domestic populations for signs of continued resistance, reflecting Manchu concerns about Chinese loyalty that previous administrations had not needed to address. The duties that had focused exclusively on external threats now encompass internal surveillance that transforms defensive personnel into domestic security forces whose primary mission involves watching Chinese subjects rather than foreign enemies. The judicial transformation happens through personnel changes rather than institutional destruction. Chinese magistrates apply Qing legal codes to local disputes, while Manchu officials handle cases involving political resistance, creating parallel systems that preserve community stability while ensuring political compliance. Traditional dispute resolution procedures continue serving community needs, while serving new political authorities whose legitimacy depends upon demonstrating superior governmental capability. Manchu engineers examine Chinese artillery pieces with professional appreciation for innovations they will adapt to serve different strategic purposes, while Chinese technical specialists explain mechanical principles that enable Manchu forces to operate captured weapons with effectiveness that equals their original Chinese operators. Knowledge transfer creates military cooperation between former enemies whose professional interests align despite cultural differences. The garrison mess halls, where Chinese soldiers had eaten meals funded by imperial taxation, now serve identical food to mixed units, where Chinese troops train alongside Manchu recruits who learn defensive techniques while teaching cavalry tactics that improve combined military effectiveness. Professional cooperation develops through shared practical necessities that transcend ethnic divisions when survival requires functional collaboration. Winter approaches the garrison compounds, where Chinese families continue living in housing designed for Ming military personnel, while adapting to Manchu administrative procedures that affect daily life through modified regulations concerning travel, taxation, and political loyalty. Community routines adapt to foreign rule through gradual adjustments that preserve essential functions, while acknowledging changed political circumstances. The merchant activity that had sustained frontier garrisons continues under Manchu authority, as Chinese traders discover that commercial relationships function regardless of political control when both parties benefit from economic exchange. Market transactions proceed according to established customs, while serving new political authorities, whose revenue needs create continued demand for taxation systems that Chinese commerce supports. In the temples of the frontier, rituals evolve to reflect recognition of Manchu rule. yet continue to safeguard the traditions that provide continuity for local communities. Buddhist monks and Taoist priests weave prayers for the well-being of Qing's sovereigns into their liturgies, embodying a pragmatic flexibility that ensures religious survival while meeting the demands of altered political circumstances. The ultimate irony crystallizes as the walls that had consumed millions of Chinese lives to keep foreigners out become the foundations upon which foreign rulers build their control over Chinese populations. The stone barriers that defined Chinese territorial identity now mark the boundaries of territory under alien administration, serving identical geographical functions while representing reversed political meaning that transforms protection into imprisonment. 4,000 years after the first Chinese hands mixed earth with blood to raise barriers against northern raiders, the Great Wall stands as humanity's longest testament to both architectural ambition and strategic delusion. Over 1 million people died building ramparts that failed to prevent every invasion they were designed to stop, while achieving a different kind of immortality altogether. The stones carry within their foundations the preserved remains of millions, whose names history never recorded, but whose calcium phosphate continues binding masonry that outlasts empires. Their sacrifice purchased not the security their rulers promised, but architectural permanence that transcends political temporality, creating monuments more enduring than the civilizations that commanded their construction. Every dynasty discovered the same terrible mathematics. Resources required to construct effective barriers exceeded the threats those barriers addressed, while human costs often created more internal enemies than external fortifications could exclude. The Qin exhausted their empire building ramparts that stood centuries after the dynasty collapsed. The Ming bankrupted their treasury, maintaining perfected fortifications that opened voluntarily to foreign conquest. The failure was never architectural, but strategic, never engineering, but political. Nomadic peoples moved like water around whatever obstacles agricultural civilizations could construct, their mobility rendering fixed defenses irrelevant except as symbols of the defensive thinking that guaranteed strategic failure while consuming resources that might have purchased genuine security through alternative methods. Yet the ramparts achieved something their builders never intended. They became humanity's most complete record of how civilizations exhaust themselves, pursuing impossible objectives with perfect competence. Each stone documents the persistence of strategic confusion that transcends cultural boundaries, as dynasty after dynasty repeated identical mistakes while expecting different results through superior execution of fundamentally flawed concepts. The deepest irony lies not in barriers failing to stop invasions, but in barriers succeeding too well at preserving evidence of their own futility. The fortifications document in stone and bone the history of Chinese strategic confusion, their preservation enabling future study of how human societies can achieve architectural immortality while pursuing political objectives forever beyond reach. The dead speak through the permanence of their work, testifying to the gap between human capability and human wisdom. Walk any section today, and your feet press upon foundations where anonymous skeletons provide structural support for tourist pathways. Their bones, ground into mortar during construction, continue performing the only function that construction ever achieved successfully, holding stones together long enough for subsequent generations to discover what previous generations could not understand during the madness of building. Through their deaths, 1 million souls became bound into the works they built, their sacrifice transformed into meaning their rulers never intended and tourists never comprehend. The irony compounds across centuries. People died building barriers to preserve Chinese civilization, and their deaths created the only aspect of Chinese civilization that proved truly imperishable. The walls endure because stone and bone create compounds more durable than political arrangements, imperial ambitions, or strategic theories. Chemistry succeeds where policy fails. Molecular bonds outlasting governmental bonds. Physical permanence mocking temporal power that commanded construction, but could not command survival of the purposes that justified construction costs measured in human generations. Modern visitors photograph battlements where ancient guards froze to death. Selfie enthusiasts pose before stones mixed with the remains of workers whose names they will never know, while tour guides repeat historical facts that carefully avoid calculating the exact human cost of each photogenic vista. The sanitized narrative protects contemporary sensibilities from confronting the mathematical reality that every scenic overlook represents dozens of unmarked graves. The stone dragon that tourists admire from observation platforms dreams eternally of security that never arrived, protection that never materialized, peace that never lasted longer than the next political crisis that demonstrated again that defensive excellence cannot compensate for strategic incompetence. Its scales glisten with morning dew that collects in crevices where human ash mixed with lime mortar continues binding materials that will outlast every government that claims authority over them. In its dreaming, the dragon remembers every worker who died believing their sacrifice served essential purposes, every engineer who calculated that next improvements would achieve previous failures, every emperor who inherited construction projects that consumed more resources than conquest would have required. The memories blend into geological time, where human urgency becomes mineral patience. Political necessity becomes structural permanence. The Great Wall stands as humanity's greatest monument to the gap between human ambition and human wisdom, between what engineering can accomplish and what political problems engineering can solve. Its success lies not in stopping invasions, but in demonstrating, with perfect clarity, the futility of attempting to stop through construction, what can only be addressed through wisdom that no dynasty possessed long enough to apply. The stone dragon sleeps forever on the bones of those who built it, dreaming of the next empire that will claim it, provides security, the next million who will die, believing ramparts can stop what always comes, change itself, arriving at dawn on horseback, flowing like water around whatever obstacles human fear can construct, carrying away everything except the stones and bones that testify to courage misapplied and excellence misdirected. Complete success and complete failure are both written into the ramparts, which survive to testify that humans may construct anything but permanence for the fleeting, may sacrifice anything but blindness, may preserve anything but the original reasons for preservation. In the end, only the stones remember what the emperors forgot, that security comes not from excluding the world, but from understanding it, not from building against change, but from adapting to change, not from perfecting barriers, but from perfecting wisdom. The dragon's dream continues, patient as geology, waiting for the species that built it to learn what the building could not teach.